Gerald Whitmore did not even flinch. That was the part Eliza would never forget, not the cold, not the stares, not the way her arms had gone numb from holding both babies through 14 hours of rough road. It was the absence of shame on his face. He stood in the middle of Caldwell's main street with his thumbs hooked in his belt, looked directly at her across 20 feet of packed dirt, and said, loud enough for every soul within earshot to hear, "I don't know this woman." Clara made a small sound against Eliza's shoulder, just a breath, barely a noise, and somehow that tiny sound was the loudest thing on the street. Eliza stood there with 2 7-month-old girls pressed against her body, a travel bag at her feet that held everything she owned in the world, and a stack of letters in her coat pocket that proved, in his own handwriting, that Gerald Whitmore was a liar. She did not scream. She did not collapse. She looked at him for a long moment, and she thought, so this is what I walked into. If you've ever been betrayed by someone who smiled at you first, if you've ever stood in a strange place with nothing but your own 2 hands and had to decide whether to fall or fight, then stay with this story. Because what Eliza Whitmore did next is not what anyone expected. Before we go further, if this is your first time here, please subscribe to our channel and hit the like button. Drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's go back to that street in Caldwell, Montana, in the autumn of 1886, where a woman with 2 babies and an empty pocket was about to make a decision that would change everything. The stagecoach had left before Eliza fully understood what was happening. She had heard the driver call Caldwell and had gathered herself slowly, carefully, the way you do when you're holding 2 infants in a travel bag and trying not to drop any of them. Clara had been fussing since the last stop teething. Eliza suspected, though she had no one to ask, and May had been unusually quiet in that watchful way she sometimes had, her dark eyes moving around like she was cataloging everything. Even at 7 months, May had always seemed older than her age. Eliza had no idea where that quality came from. Certainly not from their father. She had not thought about James Whitmore, no relation to Gerald as it turned out, which was one of the first things she should have questioned more carefully in several weeks. She had trained herself out of it. James was in Pennsylvania, which might as well have been the moon, and he had made his position on the twins clear enough when he had simply not come back after she told him. Some doors once closed should stay that way. Gerald had been different, or he had seemed different. The first letter had arrived through the agency in February, careful and plain-spoken, the handwriting slightly uneven in a way that suggested a man who didn't write often but was trying. He had described his property a good parcel, well-watered, a house that needed work, and said he was looking for a woman of practical character who understood that frontier life was not romantic. He had specifically mentioned that he was not opposed to a woman who came with children, that he understood circumstances could be complicated, and that what mattered to him was honesty and a willingness to work. Eliza had read that letter 4 times. She had written back carefully, explaining everything. The twins, their age, the situation with their father stated plainly without excuses or sentimentality. Her own background: she had worked as a bookkeeper for a dry goods merchant in Ohio for 3 years, and before that she had helped manage her mother's household through 2 winters where money had been genuinely short. She was not a woman who frightened easily, she wrote, and she was not coming, looking to be kept. She wanted honest work and a fair arrangement. Gerald had written back within 3 weeks, and then again, and then again. By June she had a stack of 11 letters, and in the 10th one he had proposed marriage in language that was not poetic but was sincere, or had read as sincere. He had asked her to come in September, after the worst of the summer heat, and had given her specific instructions about which stage line to take and where to transfer. He had even mentioned in the final letter that he had cleared out the extra room for the girls. She had sold nearly everything she owned to buy the tickets. Standing now on the main street of Caldwell, with the stagecoach disappearing around the far bend, and a crowd of maybe 30 people watching her from porches and doorways, Eliza looked at Gerald Whitmore and understood something fundamental. She had made a catastrophic mistake. "I don't know this woman," he said again, louder this time, and she realized he was performing for the audience, not speaking to her. His voice carried the particular confidence of a man who had said a thing publicly, and therefore believed the public nature of it made it true. He was taller than she had imagined from the letters, broad-shouldered, with a reddish beard going gray at the edges, and there was nothing in his face that resembled the careful, considered man who had written about well-watered land and honest arrangements. "Mr. Whitmore," Eliza said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I have your letters." "A lot of women have letters," said a man near the feed store, and several people laughed. Eliza did not look at him. She kept her eyes on Gerald. 11 letters, in your handwriting. The last one asks me to take the overland stage to Billings and transfer at the junction, which is exactly what I did." Gerald shook his head slowly, performing regret now. Miss, I'm sorry for whatever situation you're in, but I am telling you, and I am telling everyone here, that I did not write any letters to you and I have never met you before in my life. For a moment, Eliza's mind did something strange. It went very quiet, the way it had when the doctor in Ohio told her the twins had both survived delivery. That unexpected silence before the understanding arrives. She had been through enough by then to know that the quiet wasn't peace. It was the moment before the next thing. Clara chose that moment to start crying in earnest, not the fussing from before, but the real thing, the hungry cry that meant business. And Eliza shifted her weight and pressed her lips against her daughter's temple and said something quiet that wasn't really words. May, still watchful, still silent, turned her dark eyes toward Gerald and stared at him with an expression that shouldn't have been possible on a 7-month-old face. You need to leave, said a woman from the porch of what appeared to be a general store. She was not unkind exactly, but she was not kind either. Just firm, in the way that people are when they have decided something is not their problem. There's nothing here for you. There's a hotel, Eliza said. The hotel's full, said a man Eliza couldn't see. It wasn't full. She had looked at the sign from the stage and it had not said full. She picked up her travel bag. She shifted Clara onto her hip and kept May pressed against her chest, and she walked toward the hotel. The hotel was not full, but the man behind the desk, thin, with a narrow mustache, looked at her and the babies and said they didn't take in unaccompanied women with children, that it caused disruptions. When she asked him what kind of disruptions 2 7-month-olds could cause that a single drunk cowboy couldn't match, he reddened and told her she needed to leave his establishment. She left his establishment. She tried the second lodging, which was smaller, above a saloon. The woman there said she had no rooms. Eliza could see, through the open door at the top of the stairs, that at least 2 doors had no personal items outside them, the way occupied rooms always did. She said nothing about this and went back down the stairs. By the time she had tried 3 places and been turned away from all of them, May had decided she was hungry too, and both girls were making their displeasure known, and Eliza's arms had started to shake from the weight of carrying them. She sat down on a bench outside the post office, the only bench on the main street as far as she could tell, and set down the travel bag and held her daughters and thought very carefully. She had $4.70. She had the letters. She had a change of clothes for herself and 3 changes for the girls and a small tin of dried oats that she had brought for emergencies. She had a worn leather journal in which she had kept careful notes about her finances for the past 2 years. She had a folding knife that had belonged to her father, which she kept in the bag rather than on her person because she didn't like the feel of it in her skirt pocket. She did not have anywhere to sleep. She sat with this inventory for a moment, and then she fed the girls, which took 20 minutes, and drew several disapproving looks from women passing on the boardwalk, which she ignored, because disapproving looks cost nothing and the girls needed to eat. When they settled, she opened the travel bag and took out Gerald's letters, all 11, tied with a piece of twine she had saved from a package back in Ohio, and she read the last 3 again, carefully, looking for anything she might have misread. She had not misread anything. The handwriting was consistent. The personal details, his father's name, the name of the previous owner of the property, the exact dimensions of the south field, were the kind of details that came from a person's own knowledge, not from invention. Which meant Gerald Whitmore had written these letters and then decided to pretend he hadn't. The question was why, and the answer was probably simple. He had changed his mind and lacked the character to say so. Men did this. Women did it too sometimes. But men had a particular talent for choosing a dramatic public denial over a private, honest conversation. It was almost always about avoiding the discomfort of accountability rather than anything more complicated. Understanding the reason did not make her situation less desperate. She put the letters back. She watched the street for a while, the patterns of it, who went where, who spoke to whom, which businesses seemed to have regular traffic and which didn't. 3 years of bookkeeping had given her a habit of observation that she'd never been able to turn off. She noticed that the feed store had more traffic than the general store, despite being smaller. She noticed that the woman who had spoken to her from the porch of the general store seemed to be the owner, from the way she directed the boy sweeping the boardwalk. She noticed that there was a church at the far end of the street and a small building beside it that might be a school, and that 2 men she'd now seen twice appeared to have no particular occupation. They were simply present on the street, watching things, which in her experience usually meant they worked for someone who wanted to know what was happening. She noticed Gerald Whitmore cross the street twice in the hour she sat on the bench, and each time he did not look in her direction, with the deliberate effort of a man who was working at not looking. He was afraid of her. She filed that away. What she needed was work, not charity. She had refused to frame this to herself as needing rescue. because that framing would make her dependent on someone else's goodwill, and goodwill was the one currency she had absolutely no supply of at the moment. Work was different. Work was an exchange. She could do things, and there were people who needed things done, and somewhere in that arithmetic there was a path through. She tried the general store first, because the woman there had at least spoken directly to her, which was a kind of respect even if it hadn't been kind. The woman's name was Mrs. Alcott, and she listened to Eliza's proposal she could keep books, organize stock, anything that needed doing with her arms crossed, and her expression somewhere between considering and refusing. She had the look of a woman who had made 100 difficult decisions and was comfortable making them. "I can't hire a woman with 2 babies," Mrs. Alcott said finally. "It's not personal. I just can't have infants in the store." "They sleep most of the day," Eliza said, which was not entirely true but was not entirely false. "And I can keep them in a back room. You wouldn't know they were here." Mrs. Alcott's expression said she doubted that strongly. 3 days, Eliza said. "Let me work 3 days. If it's a problem, I'll leave. If it isn't, we can discuss terms." "And where are you sleeping while you work these 3 days?" Eliza didn't answer immediately, which was answer enough. Mrs. Alcott looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at the twins Clara, who had finally settled and was making small exploratory grabs at Eliza's collar, and May, who was watching Mrs. Alcott with those unnerving dark eyes. Something shifted in Mrs. Alcott's face. "I have a storage room," she said slowly. "It's not a room, it's a storage room. There's a cot in it from when my nephew stayed 2 summers ago, but it's in poor condition." "That sounds fine," Eliza said. "It's not fine, I just told you it's in poor condition. What I'm saying is I can't offer you work right now, but you can sleep in the storage room tonight while you figure out your next step. That's all I'm offering, I understand. Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Mrs. Alcott said. "Gerald Whitmore is a difficult man, and he has friends in this town. The fact that you're here and asking questions is going to cause problems." "I'm not asking questions," Eliza said. "I'm looking for work." Mrs. Alcott gave her a look that said she understood perfectly well that looking for work was asking questions in Eliza's case. She was not wrong. The storage room was exactly as described: a cot with a broken leg propped up by a folded canvas, a smell of turpentine and old grain, a single small window that let in gray afternoon light. Eliza put the girls on the cot, which had enough surface area for both of them if she positioned them carefully, and she unpacked the change of clothes and the tin of oats in her journal, and she sat on the floor and wrote down everything she knew. She had a habit of writing down what she knew when things were bad. Not feelings. She had learned early that writing down feelings made them larger and less manageable, but facts. Things she could touch and verify. Gerald had written 11 letters. She had the letters. He had publicly denied her. She had $4.70. She had 2 children who were healthy and had not so far been sick more than normally. She had skills that were real and demonstrable. She had managed accounts for a business with annual revenue of approximately $12,000. She had never made an arithmetic error that went uncaught for more than a day. She was 28 years old, and she had been through worse than this, though at the moment she would have had trouble specifying when. She wrote down the 2 men she had seen watching the street and noted they might be Whitmore's people. She wrote down Mrs. Alcott's comment about Whitmore having friends and circled it. She wrote down the name of every business she had seen on Caldwell's Main Street, and next to each one she wrote what she thought she could offer them. She fell asleep somewhere in the middle of this list and woke up when May cried at midnight and didn't go back to sleep until almost 2. In the morning, Mrs. Alcott gave her coffee without being asked and did not comment on the state of the storage room or whether Eliza had slept. She was that kind of woman, the kind who made decisions and then committed to them without second-guessing them publicly. "Eliza respected that the land office opens at 8, Mrs. Alcott said, refilling her own cup. "If your man wrote you letters about property, the land office might have records of who owns what." "Just a thought." "Thank you," Eliza said. She went to the land office. The clerk there was a young man named Ferris who was polite in a flustered way, like someone who had not expected a woman with twins to come in asking about property records first thing in the morning. He looked up Gerald Whitmore's parcel without much resistance. It was public record, he explained. Anyone could ask, and showed her the documentation. What she saw was interesting. Whitmore's property was mortgaged. Not unusual in itself, most frontier property was mortgaged. That was how the West had been built. Credit stacked on optimism. But the mortgage holder was not a local bank, and the terms were unusual. The interest rate was higher than standard, and there was a clause Eliza had to read twice, to be sure she was reading correctly. The mortgage could be called in full at the lender's discretion with 60 days' notice, regardless of payment status. She wrote down the lender's name, a company called Western Territorial Holdings, and thanked Ferris and left. She spent the rest of the morning walking the outskirts of Caldwell, which was harder than it sounded with 2 babies and a travel bag, but she needed to see what was around her. The town was larger than it had looked from the street. There were residential streets behind the main strip, several good houses, a number of smaller ones. There was a blacksmith's operation and what looked like a small livestock yard. Beyond the town's edge, she could see ranch properties spreading into the distance, the kind of scrubgrass land that could support cattle if you worked it right. She was not looking for anything specific. She was looking for the thing she did not know she was looking for, which was how you found things in a strange place. She found it at a water pump at the edge of the residential streets, where she stopped to give the girls water from her hands, an imperfect method, but the best she had, and was approached by an older man with a sunburned face and the walk of someone who had spent 30 years on horseback. He didn't introduce himself. He just stopped and looked at her in the assessing, uncomplicated way of a man who had seen a lot of people in a lot of situations and had learned to sort them quickly. "You're the woman from yesterday," he said. "With the babies." "Yes, where are you headed?" "I don't know yet," she said. "I'm looking for work." He was quiet for a moment. "Then there's a ranch about 8 miles northeast. Callahan property. He's always short on help in autumn. Not the easiest man to work for, but he's fair." "What kind of help does he need?" "All kinds. He runs a large operation. Cattle, mostly." He paused. "He's not looking for a wife, if that's what you're asking. Just labor." "That's not what I'm asking," Eliza said. Something in her answer apparently satisfied him, because he nodded and told her the direction and said Callahan didn't usually turn people away who came with something useful to offer, and that was the end of the conversation. He walked on. She never got his name. She went back to the storage room and sat with the girls for a while and thought about the mortgage terms she had seen and the name Western Territorial Holdings and the clause about calling the mortgage in full at the lender's discretion, and she thought about how that clause would function if someone wanted to pressure a landowner into selling. She thought about the 2 men she had seen watching the street. She thought about the old man at the pump who had, for reasons she couldn't fully explain, volunteered the information about Callahan's ranch. She thought, "I have $4.50. She had spent 20 cents on 2 small rolls from a woman selling from a basket, and I have 2 healthy children, and I have skills, and I am not going to sit in a storage room in Caldwell, Montana, waiting for Gerald Whitmore to decide to do the right thing." She spent the afternoon asking carefully about the road northeast. She learned it was passable, mostly. There was one difficult crossing about 4 miles out where the road dipped into a wash that ran wet in the rainy season, but it was dry now. There were no towns between here and the Callahan property, but the road was used enough that she would not be alone on it. She also learned, from a conversation with a woman at the laundry who started out wary and ended up talkative, that Callahan had run his ranch for 11 years without help from anyone in Caldwell, that he had a reputation for being difficult but not for being dishonest, and that he had fired a hand the previous spring for shorting on feed measures, which told her something about what he cared about. She also learned, from the same woman who had not meant to tell her this, that Gerald Whitmore owed money to several people in town, and that his relationship with a company called Western Territorial Holdings was the subject of some quiet conversation. She wrote all of this down. That night, in the storage room, she fed the girls and settled them and sat with her journal open and added up what she knew. The accounting of it was still mostly losses, no work, limited money, no shelter beyond tonight, a man who had publicly humiliated her, 2 small children depending entirely on her decisions. But the ledger had some entries on the other side too. She knew about the mortgage. She knew the name of the holding company. She knew the general shape of what was happening to Whitmore's property, even if she didn't yet understand all the pieces. She knew that Callahan's ranch was 8 miles northeast, and that he valued honesty and fairness in the people who worked for him. She knew she could walk 8 miles. Before she slept, she took out Gerald's letters one more time, and read the first one, the careful, plain-spoken one, the uneven handwriting that had suggested a man who was trying, and she felt, very briefly, the weight of having believed it. She had not been foolish to believe it. The letters had been convincing because they had been specific and unhurried, and had included details that felt real. Either someone had written them for Gerald, or Gerald had meant them when he wrote them, and changed his mind later, for reasons she might eventually understand. Either way, she had crossed hundreds of miles and arrived with nothing, and she was still here, and the girls were sleeping, and she had information she had not had yesterday, and tomorrow she was going to walk to Callahan's ranch and ask for honest work. She put the letters away, and closed her journal, and lay down on the floor beside the cot. She had given the usable surface to the girls, and listened to Clara breathe and May breathe, and the small sounds of Caldwell settling into night. She did not sleep for a while. She thought about the mortgage clause callable at the lender's discretion, and what it implied about the relationship between Western territorial holdings and the landowners in the territory. She thought about the word discretion, which in a legal document meant power, specifically the power to act without justification. She had seen documents like that before, in the dry goods merchant's records, and they were never in the smaller party's interest. She thought about who would want to hold that kind of power over a ranch like Whitmore's, and why, and what they might do with it. She was almost asleep when the thought arrived that she would not be able to shake. For the next several weeks, Whitmore didn't change his mind. Someone made him. She didn't know yet what that meant exactly. But she wrote it on the inside cover of her journal in the dark, feeling for the letters with the pencil, and in the morning when she read it back, it was slightly illegible but legible enough. It was a starting place. She was at the edge of Caldwell before sunrise, the girls wrapped against the autumn air, the travel bag across her shoulder, her $4.50 in her coat pocket, the letters and the journal, and her father's folding knife, all where she could reach them. The road northeast was exactly where she'd been told. The sky was the particular gray-pink of early morning on open land, and the air smelled like dry grass and distance. Clara made a sound against her chest contentment. She had learned to recognize it, and May was doing her watching thing, her eyes moving across the horizon like she was trying to measure it. Eliza walked. She had not decided yet what she would say to Wyatt Callahan. She would figure that out when she arrived, which was how she had been making decisions for several years now. Move first, think as you move, adjust when you get there. It was not the most comfortable way to live, but it was honest, and it was hers, and it had so far kept her and her daughters alive. 8 miles was 8 miles. She walked. The road northeast was harder than the woman at the laundry had made it sound. Not dangerous, just uneven and long, and the kind of terrain that looked flat until you were walking it, and realized every 100 yards had its own small variations in grade that added up, over 8 miles, to something that made your legs remember every step. Eliza had good boots at least. She had bought them the previous spring with careful intention, knowing she would be traveling, and they had held up through the journey from Ohio and the stage transfers. And now this. She was grateful for them, in the way you are grateful for things that simply do their job without failing. She crossed the wash at the 4-mile mark. It was dry as promised, but the banks were steep enough that she had to go sideways. The travel bag shifted to her front to keep her balance. Clara and May pressed together against her chest with one arm, while the other hand found purchase on the crumbling earth. May made a sound that was either protest or interest with May. It was genuinely difficult to tell. Clara grabbed a fist of Eliza's collar and held on with the grip that still surprised her, the absolute certainty of an infant who had decided something was hers. She got across, she climbed the far bank, she kept walking. By the time she could see the ranch buildings in the distance, a main house, what looked like a bunkhouse, a large barn, several smaller outbuildings, her arms had gone past, aching into the particular numbness that meant she had been carrying weight too long, and both girls had cycled through hungry, fed, sleeping, and were working their way back toward hungry again. The sun had climbed enough to be warm on her back, which was something. She stopped about 100 yards from the main gate and shifted the girls and set down the travel bag and looked at the property. It was well kept. That was the first thing. Not pretty, there was no effort toward prettiness, no window boxes or painted trim, or any of the gestures that frontier properties sometimes made toward the idea of a home. But the fences were sound, the barn doors were hung straight, the yard had been cleared of the debris that accumulated around working properties and tended to stay there. Someone ran this place with attention. The kind of attention that came from caring about function rather than appearance, which was, in Eliza's experience, the more reliable kind. There were 2 men working near the barn. She could see them from here, though not clearly, and smoke coming from what she assumed was the cookhouse. A dog appeared at the gate, a large brown animal, and looked at her without barking, which she took as a reasonable sign. She picked up the travel bag and walked to the gate. The dog sniffed at her boots, and then at the girls, and then apparently made some internal determination and sat down beside her, which was unexpected. She looked down at it. It looked up at her. "I'm looking for Wyatt Callahan," she said, partly to the dog and partly to the general air. "He's not hiring." The voice came from her left, one of the men from the barn. Closer now, a lean man in his 40s with a weathered face and the eyes of someone who had spent a lot of time making assessments. He wasn't hostile exactly, but he wasn't welcoming either. He was looking at the twins with the expression of a man who was calculating problems. "I'd like to speak with him," Eliza said. "I'm not asking you to hire me. I'm asking to speak with the man who makes that decision." A pause. The lean man, she would learn later his name was Denny Marsh, and he had worked for Callahan for 7 years, and he was the most reliable person on the property, and also the most suspicious of strangers. Looked at her for a long moment. "Wait here," he said. She waited. The dog stayed beside her. Clara had started making pre-hungry sounds, which meant Eliza had perhaps 10 minutes before the situation became more complicated. She bounced her gently and said something quiet and unimportant, and watched the barn where Denny Marsh had disappeared. The man who came out was not what she had been expecting, though she could not have said exactly what she had been expecting. Wyatt Callahan was somewhere in his mid-30s, built like someone who had done physical work his entire life and hadn't stopped, with dark hair that needed cutting, and a face that was not quite handsome, but was the kind of face that you remembered strong lines, a jaw that suggested stubbornness, eyes that were a specific shade of gray-brown that Eliza would have called cautious if she were being precise. He was not wearing a hat, which struck her as unusual for this time of day and this kind of work, and he had the slightly distracted look of a man who had been interrupted from something he was concentrating on. He stopped about 10 feet from her and looked at her the way Denny Marsh had looked at her, but with more thoroughness, not rudely, just completely, like he was reading a document. "Marsh says you want to talk," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected, unhurried. "I'm looking for work," Eliza said. "My name is Eliza Whitmore. I came to Caldwell by arrangement with Gerald Whitmore, no relation, and the arrangement fell through. I have skills that are useful. I can manage accounts, organize supply records, handle correspondence, manage a kitchen if needed. I'm asking for honest work at honest wages." Callahan looked at the twins. "How old? 7 months, both of them." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Where are you sleeping?" "I was in Caldwell last night." "I'm not there tonight." Something moved through his expression that she couldn't read. He looked back at her face, and then at the travel bag, and then at the twins again, and she could see him working through calculations. The kind of calculations that men made when they were deciding whether a situation was going to be more trouble than it was worth. "What kind of accounts?" he said. "Anything. Payroll, inventory, procurement. I kept the books for a dry goods merchant in Ohio for 3 years. Annual revenue of $12,000. Never an uncorrected error. 12,000 is not what I'm running here. I know. I'm telling you what I'm capable of, not what I think you need." He looked at her again. That same thorough look. She held it steadily, which was not entirely effortless. There was something in Callahan's gaze that was uncomfortable in the way that real attention is sometimes uncomfortable, as opposed to the social performance of attention that most people offered. "I'm not looking for a wife," he said, bluntly, but not unkindly. "I'm aware. I'm not looking to be anyone's wife at the moment, given recent experience." She said it dryly and watched to see if it landed, and it did. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, barely, just the suggestion of something. "What do you need?" he said. "A place to sleep for me and my daughters and work to earn it. That's all." He turned and looked back at the property for a moment, as if consulting it. "Then I've got a small room off the back of the cookhouse. It's used for storage right now, but it can be cleared. Meals with the hands. In return, you start on the supply records. Marsh says they're a mess, and I don't have time to deal with them. 3 weeks. If it works, we discuss a longer arrangement." 3 weeks is fine," Eliza said. "My hands are going to have opinions," he said, "about you being here. Some of them will keep those opinions to themselves. Some won't. I don't involve myself in social difficulties unless they affect the work." "I can manage social difficulties," she said. "I expect you can," he said, and it wasn't quite a compliment, but it wasn't nothing. The room off the cookhouse was, as described, used for storage. It smelled of old flour and something that turned out to be a broken jar of preserves that had been there long enough to fossilize. There was no cot. There was a wooden shelf that could function as one if she arranged her extra clothes into something resembling a mattress. There was a hook on the door and a small window and a latch that worked. She cleared the room herself because asking for help in the first hour seemed like the wrong approach. The cook, a wide man named Foster, who said approximately 8 words to her in the first week, but whose 8 words were always directly useful, showed her where the cleaning things were kept without being asked, which she took as a form of acceptance. She put the girls on her arranged clothes bed and got to work on the supply records. They were, as Marsh had said, a mess. Not because no one was keeping them, but because 2 different people had been keeping them in 2 different systems simultaneously, and neither system was complete, and the result was a set of books that told you something had been spent, but not always what, and something had been received, but not always from whom. And the numbers lined up on certain pages, and on other pages were separated by gaps that could mean anything from lost receipts to something more deliberate. She spent the first evening just organizing what was there, separating the 2 systems, identifying which entries had supporting documentation and which didn't, creating a list of questions. She did this with Clara, asleep beside her on the shelf bed, and May sitting in the travel bag, which she had discovered could function as a passable contained seat if she packed it correctly, watching the candlelight with those observant dark eyes. By the second evening she had the shape of it, By the end of the first week, she had a clear picture of the supply situation, which was functional but inefficient. Callahan was paying two different suppliers for the same categories of goods and getting better prices from neither of them because neither knew about the other. And there were 3 recurring orders that she could identify had been fulfilled at above market rates going back at least 18 months. She brought this to Callahan at the end of the first week. It was in what served as his office, a corner of the main house that had a desk buried under papers and a window that looked out at the north field, and he was doing something with a map that he folded away when she came in, not quickly enough for her not to notice that it was a survey map of the surrounding territory. She spread her summary on the desk beside his papers and walked him through it. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. Some men interrupted constantly when a woman was explaining things, as a way of demonstrating that they had already understood. Callahan just listened, his eyes moving between her and the pages, and when she finished, he asked 3 questions, all of them good questions, the kind that showed he had actually processed what she said, rather than just waited for her to stop talking. The overcharging, he said, the 18 months. Who's the supplier? Merrick Voss, listed here as MV Supply. The pattern is consistent every 3rd or 4th order. The quantity matches the invoice, but the per unit cost is 3 to 8% higher than the previous order. Not enough to notice on any single transaction, but over 18 months it adds up. She showed him the number. He looked at it for a moment. That's not a mistake, he said. No, she agreed. It's not. He sat back and looked out the window at the north field. His expression was the one she was beginning to recognize as his thinking expression, very still, slightly contracted, like a man consulting something internal. Voss has been supplying this ranch since my father's, he said. I know. That's in the record, she paused. That might be relevant. He looked at her. Meaning what? Meaning I don't know yet. I'm just noting that the overcharging pattern starts 18 months ago, which would be approximately. She looked at her notes, approximately 4 months after you took over full management of the property. The silence that followed was not comfortable. She had known it wouldn't be. That was the kind of observation that landed hard, regardless of how carefully you worded it. But she had made a decision when she came to this ranch that she was going to be direct and accurate, because the alternative was to soften things until they were useless. You're saying someone knew my father wouldn't notice but wasn't sure about me, Callahan said. I'm saying the timing is notable, she said. What it means, I can't tell you. It might mean nothing. It might mean someone tested the new management and decided the water was still warm enough. He was quiet again. Then keep going, if there's more. There was more. She had been careful not to bring everything at once, not because she was being strategic exactly, but because she was genuinely still working through it, and she didn't want to present conclusions she hadn't fully verified. But what she had found in the second week went beyond Merrick Voss. She had been cross-referencing the supply records with the property documents. Callahan had kept in a secondary ledger something she had asked to review, and he had given her access to without much comment, which had surprised her, and she had found a series of entries that related to a company she recognized, Western Territorial Holdings, the same company whose name was on Gerald Whitmore's mortgage. She did not tell Callahan this immediately. She sat with it for 2 days, checking her reading, making sure she understood what she was looking at. The Callahan Ranch had its own relationship with Western Territorial Holdings, not a mortgage, but a series of supplier contracts routed through a subsidiary company called Hargrove Land and Provisions, which she found referenced in 3 separate places in the records. She wrote the name Hargrove in her journal and circled it, and then she went looking for more. What she found, in fragments across the property records, the supply ledgers, and 2 boxes of correspondence that Callahan had offered to her when she mentioned she was looking for any earlier documentation, was a picture that was still incomplete but had a definite shape. Western Territorial Holdings and its various subsidiaries, including Hargrove Land and Provisions, had financial relationships with at least 4 properties in the territory that she could identify from the records available to her. In each case, the relationship had begun with what appeared to be legitimate supplier contracts or financing arrangements. In each case, over time, the terms had shifted in ways that were not immediately obvious: interest rates that crept upward, supplier costs that inflated gradually, contracts that contained clauses allowing the counterparty to make changes with limited notice. The name Calder Hargrove appeared in 2 pieces of correspondence, both from several years earlier. He was described in one as the principal of Western Territorial Holdings, in the other simply as the man from Helena. In both letters written by different people, in different handwriting, the tone was the same: careful, slightly deferential. The tone of people writing about someone they were not entirely comfortable with. She was working through a 3rd box of old correspondence on a Tuesday evening when she found the letter that changed what she thought she understood. It was addressed to Callahan's father, Thomas Callahan, from the salutation, and it was dated approximately 8 years earlier. The handwriting was formal, and the language was legal in the way that non-lawyers sometimes tried to make things sound legal, and it referenced a previous arrangement regarding the water rights on the North Field in terms that strongly implied the arrangement was not a voluntary one. The North Field. The map Callahan had been looking at when she came into the office. She thought about the way he had folded it away. She read the letter 3 times. Then she put it carefully in her journal and sat for a while listening to the girls breathe in the dark and thinking about water rights and mortgages and companies with subsidiary names and what it meant that a man named Calder Hargrove appeared in the records of both this ranch and Gerald Whitmore's property. She was no longer thinking about Gerald Whitmore as a simple problem. She was beginning to think he was a symptom of something larger, a man who had done something dishonest, or been pressured into doing something dishonest, as a way of concealing a larger situation that she did not yet fully understand. She had written in her journal on the night she left Caldwell, Whitmore didn't change his mind. Someone made him. She was beginning to think she understood who. She told none of this to Callahan immediately. She kept working, kept clearing the supply records, kept feeding and sleeping the girls in the small room off the cookhouse. She established a rhythm with the ranch that was not comfortable exactly. She did not expect comfort, but was functional. Foster the cook allowed her use of the cookhouse in off hours without comment. Denny Marsh had moved from suspicious to watchful, which was progress. 2 of the hands were openly unfriendly in the way that men sometimes were toward women who arrived in unexpected ways and didn't behave according to understood categories. But they were unfriendly at a distance which she could manage. One of the hands, a younger man named Cal Briggs, who couldn't have been more than 22, had taken an immediate and transparent interest in the twins that had nothing to do with Eliza. Herself, he simply appeared to like babies in the uncomplicated way that some people did, and he had a habit of stopping by the cookhouse door in the morning and making faces at whichever twin was visible, which Smay regarded with scholarly seriousness, and Clara responded to with what could only be described as delight. Eliza watched this without comment. She was aware that Cal Briggs was making her situation slightly easier by making the twins a subject of amusement rather than inconvenience, and she was aware that he was probably not thinking about it in those terms, and she was grateful in the way you were grateful when something good happened without calculation behind it. On the 14th day, she went to Callahan's office and put her journal on his desk, open to the page where she had written the letter summary and drawn out the company relationships she had been able to trace. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. "The letter about the water rights," he said finally. "Where did you find that? 3rd box. The one you brought from the barn. I didn't know that letter was in there." He said it quietly, not as an accusation. More like a man confirming something he had half suspected. "The water rights on the North Field," she said carefully. "Are they currently uncontested?" He looked up from the journal. His eyes were doing the careful, thorough thing again, and she held it the same way. She had the first day steadily, because she had nothing to hide, and because this was not a moment for looking away. "Hargrove made a claim 3 years ago," he said. "His lawyer said the original deed had a flaw. I got my own lawyer, which cost a significant amount, and it was resolved." He paused. "Or I thought it was resolved. What does resolved mean exactly?" Another pause longer. She could see the discomfort moving through him, not the social discomfort of a man who didn't like questions, but something more structural, the discomfort of someone who had closed a chapter, and was now being shown that it wasn't closed. "There was a payment," he said, "to Western Territorial Holdings, as part of the settlement." "How much?" he told her. "It was not a small number." "And the water rights are secured now? You have documentation?" "I have documentation. Can I see it?" He got up and went to the secondary ledger and found the folder and handed it to her. She read it carefully. It was, on its surface, a reasonable settlement document. But there was a clause, and there it was, the same kind of clause she had seen in Gerald Whitmore's mortgage, allowing Western Territorial Holdings to reopen the claim if new evidence of the original deed flaw came to light. "New evidence defined how?" she said. He leaned over and read where she was pointing. His jaw tightened. "Defined by them," he said. "Yes," she said. "Defined by them." They stood there for a moment with that between them. Outside, she could hear Denny Marsh giving instructions to someone near the barn, and farther away the particular sound of cattle low, persistent, the sound of a working property going about its business. "You said you found Hargrove's name on Whitmore's records, too," Callahan said. He was looking at her journal again, at the diagram she had drawn of the company relationships. "I didn't have access to Whitmore's records," she said. "I saw the mortgage documentation at the land office in Caldwell. Western Territorial Holdings is the mortgage holder. The terms include a callable clause similar to the one in your settlement." "You went to the land office?" "Yes, before you came here." "Yes." He looked at her. Something in his expression was hard to read, not suspicion, she thought. Or not exactly. More like a man recalibrating something. Why, he said. You didn't know anything about my ranch yet. Why were you looking at Whitmore's mortgage? It was a fair question, and it deserved a fair answer. Because I was trying to understand why Whitmore would publicly deny knowing me when he had written 11 letters asking me to come. The simplest answer was that he changed his mind and lacked the character to say so privately. But something didn't settle right. A man who writes 11 careful letters and includes specific property details and asks a woman to bring her children isn't usually the kind of man who makes a choice like that. She paused. I was looking for what pressured him. Callahan looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "Did you find it?" Not directly. But Western Territorial Holdings holds his mortgage on terms that give them extraordinary control. If someone wanted Whitmore to do something, including deny a prior agreement threatening to call the mortgage, would be a very effective mechanism. That's speculation. Yes, she agreed. Most of what I have right now is pattern, not proof. I'm telling you the pattern. He sat down. He put his elbows on the desk and his hands over his face for a moment in a way that was entirely human and unguarded. The gesture of a man who was tired and processing something he hadn't wanted to find. She did not say anything because there was nothing useful to say. When he took his hands down, his expression had settled into something harder. Not angry, resolved maybe. The way someone looked when they had been trying to avoid a fight and finally accepted they weren't going to be allowed to. What do you need, he said, to build the proof? More records, she said. Specifically any correspondence with Hargrove Land and Provisions directly. Any contracts signed in the last 5 years. And anything relating to the original deed on the North Field, the deed your father had before the settlement. I have some of that. Some of it might be in Caldwell. My father used a lawyer there. Ferris at the land office may be able to help with historical documentation, she said. He was cooperative when I went before. Callahan nodded slowly. I'll need to think about how much of this to share with the hands. If Hargrove has people watching, he does, she said. I noticed 2 men in Caldwell who appeared to be watching the main street without a clear purpose. I don't know if they're still there. He was quiet. Then how do you notice things like that? I pay attention, she said. I've been paying attention my whole life. It's how I've managed. She said it without self-consciousness, because it was simply true. It's also useful for bookkeeping. Most people who make errors in accounts or in other things don't make them because they're unintelligent. They make them because they stop paying attention to details they've decided don't matter. He looked at her again in that thorough way, and this time something in it was different, not just assessment, but something closer to recognition. The look of a person seeing another person clearly for the first time and being surprised by what's there. You've been here 2 weeks, he said. You've reorganized my supply records, identified an ongoing fraud by my supplier, traced a likely connection between a land speculator and the man who was supposed to marry you, and found a letter my father never showed me about a dispute over my own property. Yes, she said. And you're sleeping in a storage room, and you have 2 babies. Yes, she said again. He was quiet for a moment. The room situation isn't permanent, he said. There's a room in the main house. It was used as a sewing room. It has a proper door and a window, and it's larger. You should move. She looked at him carefully. That's a different kind of arrangement. It's not, he said, with a flat certainty that she found actually reassuring. It's a practical decision. You're doing work that requires privacy and space and a proper desk, and you need to be able to work when the girls are sleeping without walking across the yard in the dark. It's not a different kind of arrangement, she thought about this. She thought about the way the hands would read it, the way Caldwell would read it, if word traveled, which it would, because word always traveled. I'll think about it, she said. That's reasonable, he said. She went back to the cookhouse. Cal Briggs was at the door on schedule, making some elaborate face at May, that May was regarding with full scholarly attention. Clara was asleep on the arranged clothes shelf bed. The candle on the small table was burning low enough that she needed to replace it. She sat down with her journal and read back over her notes the company names, the clause language, the dates, the letter about the water rights, and she thought about Calder Hargrove, whom she had not yet met, whom she knew only as a name and old correspondence and a set of patterns and numbers, but who was beginning to feel very real. She thought about Wyatt Callahan sitting at his desk with his hands over his face. She thought about 11 letters from a man who had apparently been pressured into betraying every word he'd written, and about what it meant to make someone deny a thing they had chosen of their own accord. She thought, the pattern I have is not proof. Proof requires documents and signatures and ideally witnesses. Proof requires someone who knows more than she currently knows to give her access to what they know. She wrote in her journal, find the other ranchers. Find who else Hargrove has done this to. Nobody does this once. She underlined it twice, which was unusual for her. She was not generally a woman who underlined things. Outside, the ranch had gone quiet, with the specific quiet of a working property at night, the sounds still there. Animals and wind, and the occasional voice of a hand finishing some last task, but muffled. The volume of a place that had done its day's work. She listened to it and thought that it was, despite everything, a sound she had come to find steadying. 8 miles from a town that had turned her away. In a storage room off a cookhouse, with 2 sleeping daughters and a stack of documents that added up to something larger than anyone on this ranch yet fully understood. She was not safe. She knew that. Safety was probably a long way off, in the direction of proof and legal processes and confrontations she had not yet thought through completely. But she was not helpless either, and she was not without resources. She had her skills. She had the records. She had Callahan's cautious, clear-eyed willingness to hear what she found. She realized, the beginning of something that was not quite an alliance, but was moving in that direction. 2 people who had been operating alone, each sitting on pieces of a problem too large for one person to handle, who had found each other by the particular accident of an old man at a water pump and a woman who decided 8 miles was walkable. She blew out the candle. In the dark, May made a small sound, not distress, just presence. The sound of a person registering that the world had changed slightly and filing it for review. Clara slept through it completely, as Clara slept through most things, with the magnificent indifference of someone who had decided the world was fundamentally manageable. Eliza lay down and stared at the ceiling she couldn't see, and thought about the North Field and water rights and the way Callahan had said, defined by them with his jaw tight and his voice controlled, the voice of a man who had swallowed something that hadn't gone down right, and had been waiting a long time to say so. She thought, he has been waiting for someone to bring him the shape of this problem in a form he could act on. She thought, I can do that. She closed her eyes. She did not sleep immediately. She rarely did. There was always the next set of facts, arranging and rearranging themselves. But eventually, the sounds of the ranch and the breathing of her daughters did what they always did, which was pull her under by sheer insistence. In the morning, she would start on the Hargrove land and provisions contracts. In the morning, she would make a list of the other parts she had identified as likely targets and think about how to reach the people who owned them. In the morning, she would tell Callahan she would take the room in the main house, because he was right that it was a practical decision, and she had not come 8 miles and found this much to let pride about appearances slow her down. But that was morning. For now, she slept. The Hargrove land and provisions contracts were in a leather folder at the bottom of the second box, underneath a stack of receipts that had been filed without order by someone who had apparently believed that proximity to the relevant documents was close enough to actual organization. Eliza found them on a Wednesday morning while the girls slept, and the cookhouse was quiet between breakfast and the midday preparations, and she then spread them on the desk. In the room she had moved into 3 days earlier, Callahan's practical decision, which had turned out to be exactly as practical as he said, and nothing more complicated. Though she noticed that Denny Marsh had watched the move with the expression of a man storing information, and she read through every page carefully, twice. The contracts were not obviously fraudulent. That was the first thing, and it was important. Someone who looked at them quickly would see standard supplier agreements, quantities, prices, delivery schedules, penalty clauses for non-delivery. Everything in the right place, worded correctly, signed by both parties. Callahan's father's signature on the older ones. Callahan's own signature on the 2 that had been renewed after he took over management. The problem was in the renewal language. In the original contracts, the pricing structure had a fixed rate with a ceiling on annual increases reasonable, standard, the kind of language a fair supplier put in to give both parties predictability. In the renewals, both of which Callahan had signed in his first year, managing the ranch, that language had been quietly replaced. The ceiling was gone. In its place was language that tied pricing to what the contract called prevailing territory rates, defined at the supplier's discretion. Prevailing territory rates at the supplier's discretion. She wrote this down, and then sat for a moment and looked at what she had written. This was not an accident. Whoever had drafted the renewal contracts had known exactly what they were changing and why. The change was small enough that a man signing a renewal on an existing supplier relationship, a relationship that had been in place since his father's time, that he had no reason to distrust, would likely not catch it without reading both versions side by side. She went back to the first box and found the originals, laid them next to the renewals. The sections were formatted identically. The change was 4 words and a deleted clause. She took both to Callahan that afternoon. He read them at his desk without speaking. She watched him find it, the slight tension in his face. When he reached the pricing section, the pause, the going back to reread. He was not a slow reader, she had observed. He simply read carefully, the way someone did who had learned that missing things in written agreements was expensive. I signed this, he said. Not as an accusation of himself, more as a statement he was working to accept. You signed a renewal of an existing agreement, she said. The change is subtle. It was designed to be. Designed by who? Voss presented the contracts, but Voss doesn't write legal language. Someone wrote this for him. She put her finger on the clause. This is the same structure as the callable provision in your water rights settlement. Different document, different context, same underlying logic, give one party discretionary authority over the terms that matter most. Callahan looked up. Hargrove's people drafted both. That's what the pattern suggests. I can't prove it yet without seeing the drafting correspondence, which I don't have. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, she could hear Cal Briggs talking to someone near the barn, his voice carried, young and uncomplicated, describing something about the condition of a fence line. Normal ranch business, going on around a conversation that was anything but normal. How many other ranches do you think he's done this to? Callahan said. In this territory? I've identified 4 from the records I've seen. But I've only seen what you have here and what's publicly available at the land office. There could be more. 4, at minimum. He stood up and went to the window, the one that looked out at the north field, which she had noticed was the window he went to when he was thinking. The north field was the center of it for him. She understood that now. Not because it was the most valuable part of the property, though it might be, but because it was the thing that had already been used against him, the place where someone had already found a way in. There's a man named Rutherford, he said, still looking out the window. Had a spread about 12 miles east. Good water, good land. He sold out 2 years ago, said his debts had gotten away from him and he couldn't recover. Took his family to Oregon. He paused. I never thought too much about it. Frontier operations fail. It happens. Do you know who bought his land? A pause. Western Territorial Holdings. She wrote the name in her journal, though she already had it there. That's 5. He turned from the window. His face had the resolved look she had seen before, but sharper now, the look of a man who had stopped waiting to be sure and had arrived at a decision. I want to go to Caldwell, he said. Talk to Ferris at the land office. See what the public record shows about the Rutherford sale and any others. That's a reasonable next step, she said, but carefully. If Hargrove has people watching Caldwell, and I believe he does, your appearing at the land office, asking about land transactions will be noticed. Let it be noticed. Not yet, she said. Not until we have enough that being noticed doesn't matter because we have something they can't suppress. She paused. Right now we have a pattern and some suggestive documents. That's not enough. If Hargrove becomes aware that you're building a case before the case is built, he has options. He could call your water rights settlement clause. He could accelerate whatever timeline he has for the ranch. Callahan looked at her steadily. You think he already has a timeline? The supplier overcharging has been running for 18 months. That's not indefinite, that's a preparation phase. Someone is weakening your financial position before making a move. She kept her voice level because the information was alarming enough without her adding alarm to it. I think whatever he's planning for this ranch, he's planning to execute it in the not very distant future. The silence that followed was the kind that had weight. Then we move faster, Callahan said. We move smarter, she said. Faster and smarter, ideally. He almost smiled, not quite, but almost. She had started to understand his almost smiles as a distinct form of communication. He was not a man who laughed easily or displayed warmth in the ways that people usually expected warmth to be displayed. But he listened with absolute attention, and he did not dismiss things she said because she was a woman with 2 babies and no formal standing. And the almost smiles were his acknowledgement that she had said something he recognized as true. It was, she thought, a limited but genuine currency. She spent the next 4 days working through everything available in the house. While Callahan made quiet inquiries through a network, she only partially understood Hans, who had friends on other properties, a contact in Billings who apparently owed him something, an older rancher named Pollard, who lived about 6 miles north and seemed to be the kind of man that other men reported things to. She was not privy to all of these conversations, and she did not ask to be. She had her own work, and she had learned early that trying to be present for everything was a way of doing nothing well. May had developed an opinion about the new room. The opinion was favorable. She spent her alert hours cataloging every surface she could see from whatever position she was placed in, and the room had more surfaces than the cookhouse storage, which seemed to satisfy some need for inventory that May appeared to have been born with. Clara, for her part, had discovered that making a specific noise caused the adults in the room to stop what they were doing and pay attention, and was deploying this discovery with scientific thoroughness. Eliza worked around them the way she had been working around them since they were born, not by ignoring them, but by building them into the rhythm of the work. Feed, settle, 30 minutes of uninterrupted focus, attend to whatever need had arisen, settle another 30 minutes. It was not efficient by any abstract standard, But she had not had the luxury of abstract standards for some time, and the girls were healthy and growing, and Clara had just in the past week demonstrated an ability to roll from her back to her side, which was apparently a significant development, though Eliza had no one to compare notes with on the subject. She was thinking about this, about the rolling, and about the complete absence of anyone in her life who would care about Clara rolling over, and about the specific loneliness of being capable and busy, and still fundamentally alone, when Callahan knocked on the open door of the room one evening, with a piece of paper in his hand. Pollard went into Caldwell today, he said. He talked to Ferris. She looked up, and he came in and spread the paper on the desk beside her journal. It was a list in Pollard's uneven handwriting: property names, owner names, transaction dates, buyers. 7 properties in the territory, all sold within the past 4 years. All purchased by Western Territorial Holdings or one of its named subsidiaries. 7, not 4, not 5. Rutherford's is on there, Callahan said, pointing. And look at this one. The one he pointed to was a property called the Sinclair Spread, sold 18 months ago. Sinclair was a name she didn't know. But the buyer was not Western Territorial Holdings. It was a company called Meridian Range Holdings, which she had not seen before. Different company, she said. Different name, same address in Helena, Callahan said. Pollard checked. So he was layering the subsidiaries, using different names to obscure the pattern from anyone who looked at any one piece. You would have to look at all the pieces together, which was exactly what she was doing, to see the same hand. She wrote Meridian Range Holdings in her journal and drew a line connecting it to Western Territorial Holdings and put Hargrove's name at the center with a circle around it. Who was Sinclair, she said. Old family. Had the land for 20 years. Good operation, he paused. His wife died 2 years ago. He sold out 6 months later, and no one's heard from him since. She looked at the list again. The pattern of the timing: deaths, family disruptions, financial difficulties, then sale. It was not coincidence. Hargrove or someone working for him was watching these properties for moments of vulnerability and moving at precisely those moments. He's patient, she said, very. Which means he won't be rushed into mistakes. She sat back. He'll only move against us when he's sure, or when he thinks we're not going to be a problem. Then we need to convince him we're not going to be a problem, Callahan said, while we build enough to take to someone who can actually do something about it. A federal land agent, she said, not local. Local officials in Caldwell may or may not be independent of Hargrove's influence. Not may or may not, Callahan said flatly. The county recorder was appointed through a process that Hargrove had a hand in. I didn't put that together until recently, but I'm sure of it. She absorbed this. Then we need documentation strong enough to go over local jurisdiction. Federal level. There's a land agent, Billings, he said. Man named Gerber. Pollard says he's honest, which in this context means he doesn't have any known relationship with Western Territorial Holdings. That's where we take it, she said, when we have enough. How much is enough? She looked at her journal, the diagram, the property names, the clause language, the company addresses. We need at least one witness who can speak directly to having been pressured by Hargrove or his representatives. Pattern evidence and document analysis can be discounted as misinterpretation. A human voice is harder to dismiss. Rutherford's in Oregon. Rutherford is one possibility. But he's gone, and reaching him would take time. She tapped the list. Someone on this list is still in the territory, still close, and probably still angry. Callahan looked at the list. His finger moved to a name near the bottom, Hooper. The notation next to it said the sale was 14 months ago, more recent than most. Hooper's brother runs a small freight operation out of a town called Ridgeline, about 20 miles west. I've met him. Reliable man. Do you know if Hooper himself is still in the territory? I can find out, then find out, quietly. He nodded. He started to fold the paper, then stopped. There's something else, he said. He said it in the tone that meant the something else was the thing he had actually come to say, and everything before it had been approach. She waited. Hargrove is coming to Caldwell, he said. Pollard heard it in town. He's apparently making what he calls a tour of his investments. He'll be there in approximately 2 weeks. She sat with this for a moment. Does he know about me? Pollard doesn't think so. You're just a woman I hired. There's no reason Hargrove would connect you to anything yet. But if he's coming here to review his investments, he'll be talking to Voss. And Voss will likely mention that the supply records were audited. Yes, Callahan said, that's the problem. The problem was actually several problems nested inside each other. If Voss told Hargrove that someone had reviewed the supply records, Hargrove would want to know who and what they found. If he found out what she had found or suspected she had found, he would move faster. 2 weeks, maybe less. We need Hooper, she said, as quickly as possible. I'll ride to Ridgeline tomorrow. Be careful about who knows why you're going. I'll tell Marsh I'm checking on a freight arrangement, he said, which is partly true. I do have business with the freight operation there. She nodded. Then there's another thing I haven't told you yet. He looked at her. The letter about the water rights, your father's letter. The one that referenced a previous arrangement. She opened her journal to the page where she had written her summary of it. The language implies that your father made some kind of agreement with Hargrove's people before the formal claim 3 years ago. Something informal, possibly under pressure. The letter doesn't spell out the details, but it reads like a man confirming an arrangement he wasn't happy about. Callahan's expression was very still. I don't know what the arrangement was, she said carefully, and it may not be relevant to the current situation. But if Hargrove is aware of it, it's possible he's been using it as leverage, not openly, but as background pressure. The kind of thing a man holds over a family and never has to actually name, because the family knows it's there. A long silence. My father was not a dishonest man, Callahan said. Not defensive, just stating what he believed. I don't think the letter suggests he was. It reads more like a man who was maneuvered into a corner and made the best decision he could see at the time. She paused, which is how these things work usually. It's rarely the person's character that fails them. It's the structure of the situation. He was quiet for long enough that she began to wonder if she had said too much. She had a tendency to be direct at moments when directness was not entirely comfortable, and she was aware of it but had never found a way to soften it that didn't feel dishonest. Do you think Hargrove will try to use it against us? He said. Us. She noticed the word but didn't remark on it. If he finds out what we're doing, he'll use everything available to him. That includes anything relating to your family's history with him. She paused. Which is why if there's anything you know, anything your father told you, anything you've suspected but not examined, you should tell me now, before Hargrove decides to tell the story his way. He stood up and went to the window again. The north field was dark at this hour, just the shape of it against the slightly lighter sky, the specific darkness of land that went on for a while. My father borrowed money from Western Territorial Holdings, he said finally, before the mortgage with the local bank. Early on, when the ranch was getting established, it was repaid. I found the records when I was going through his papers after he died. Repaid with significant interest. He stopped. And the loan agreement had a clause that said Western Territorial Holdings retained a right of first refusal on any sale of the property for 20 years from the date of the loan. She kept her expression steady. Which 20 years ends when? 3 years from now. She wrote it down. Right of first refusal, 20 years, expires in 3 years. That was the timeline. That was why the preparation phased the supplier overcharging. The financial weakening had started 18 months ago. Hargrove needed the ranch to be in financial distress by the time the right of first refusal was active, and the ranch was theoretically at its most vulnerable. He's been building toward a forced sale, she said. When the ranch is weakened enough that you either can't refuse his offer, or you don't know you have the right to. Or I don't know the offer is supposed to be fair, Callahan said. He had understood it now. She could see it in his face, the full shape of it, the years of it. Yes, he turned from the window. What does right of first refusal mean in practice? Can he force a sale? No, he can only match any offer you receive if you choose to sell. He cannot force you to sell. She paused. But if your financial situation deteriorates enough that your lenders are calling loans, you may not have a choice about selling. That's the mechanism. Not direct compulsion, manufactured necessity. He puts me in a position where I have to sell, Callahan said slowly, and then he gets to buy. At whatever price he offers, because if you're distressed enough, you take what's available. He stood there with that for a moment. She let him. 18 months, he said. He's been at this for 18 months since I took over. That we can document. It may have started earlier with the water rights claim. 3 years ago. 3 years of pressure, she said, with the end point being the clause expiration. The anger that moved through his face was controlled but real, not the explosive kind that burned itself out, but the settled kind that went somewhere useful. She had seen both kinds of anger in men, and the settled kind was, in her experience, more reliable. All right, he said. He said it quietly with finality. What do we do first? You ride to Ridgeline tomorrow. I finished the document summary tonight, so that everything we have is in writing, organized, in a form that can be presented to someone outside this room. She looked at her journal, and we keep the routine of the ranch exactly as it has been. Nothing changes that Hargrove's people could notice. He nodded. Marsh is going to need to know some of this. Not all, but enough to understand why I might ask him to handle certain things differently. Marsh, I trust your judgment on, she said. You know him better than I do. He started for the door. Then he stopped. He turned partway, not quite looking at her directly. The room arrangement, he said. The hands have been talking. I know. I told Marsh it was a practical decision. That's what it is. He believes me, Callahan said. Most of the others do too. A pause. I just wanted you to know that I said so, that I was clear about it. She understood what he was doing. He was telling her that he had defended her. Not as a favor, but as a matter of accuracy, that her situation was what she had said it was, and he had said so publicly, and he would continue to say so. It was not a small thing. It was actually exactly the kind of thing she had not expected to have. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once and left. She sat for a while after he was gone, listening to May make small sounds of commentary on the ceiling, and to Clara breathe the deep, even breath of a baby who had decided sleeping was her current occupation. The candle on the desk put out a steady light, and her journal was open to the diagram she had drawn the company names, the lines between them, Hargrove's name in the center. She added new lines. The loan from before the bank mortgage, the right of first refusal clause, the 20-year timeline, the expiration date 3 years from now, the 18 months of supplier overcharging, the water rights settlement, the manufactured distress, the planned vulnerability, the exit waiting for the right moment. She drew a box around all of it and wrote at the top what he plans to do. Then on a fresh page she wrote what we are going to do instead. She sat with a blank page for a moment. Then she started writing. Find Hooper witness, direct experience of pressure. Contact Ridgeline through Callahan's freight connection. Timeline urgent before Hargrove's visit to Caldwell. Find earlier records the original loan documentation, the full text of the right of first refusal clause, any correspondence with Western Territorial Holdings predating Callahan's management. Source, Callahan's father's papers, possibly a lawyer in Caldwell. Document the Voss overcharging completely all 18 months. All transactions, per unit price comparisons. Source, supply records already in hand. Document the settlement clause in the Hargrove land and provisions contract renewals with full comparison to originals. Source, already in hand. Identify Hargrove's Helen address and any public registration documents for Western Territorial Holdings and its subsidiaries. Source, Pollard's contact and billings, or directly through Gerber, the federal land agent. She wrote, do not go to Caldwell. Not yet. Let Hargrove think nothing is happening here. And then, below that, the thing she had been thinking about since Callahan told her about the visit, Hargrove coming to Caldwell is a risk, but also an opportunity. A man making a tour of his investments is a man who can be observed. She had been observed. She had been turned away from hotels and watched from porches and dismissed from main streets. She had walked 8 miles with 2 babies and asked a stranger for honest work. She had learned, in the past 3 weeks, that being in the background and watching was often more useful than being in the center of things, and that the people who were most dangerous were usually the ones who assumed the people they had discounted weren't paying attention. Calder Hargrove had built his operation on the assumption that the people he was maneuvering were too distracted, too isolated, too beaten down by circumstance to see the shape of what was being done to them. She was not too distracted. She was not isolated. She had Callahan now, and through him Pollard and Marsh, and the beginning of something wider. She had been beaten down by circumstance and had gotten back up and walked 8 miles and found her way to the desk she was currently sitting at. She blew out the candle and sat in the dark for a moment before getting up to check the girls. May was awake, which was normal at this hour. She was looking at the ceiling with an expression that said she had reached some conclusion about it and was now prepared to move on to the next subject. When Eliza leaned over her, May redirected those dark eyes and looked at her with the same scholarly attention. I know, Eliza said quietly. I'm working on it. May made a sound that could have been agreement. She settled the girls and lay down, and did not immediately sleep as usual. She thought about what Callahan had said about his father, that he was not a dishonest man, the certainty of it, the way a person stated something that mattered to them without embellishment. She thought about Thomas Callahan, making an agreement he wasn't happy about because the structure of the situation left him no visible alternative. She thought about Gerald Whitmore on Caldwell's Main Street, saying, I don't know this woman, in a voice that performed certainty, and whether somewhere behind that performance there had been shame. She had been angry at Gerald Whitmore for a long time, and she was still angry, in the way that a wrong done to you does not stop being a wrong because you understand its context. But she was beginning to place the anger more precisely. The man who had written 11 careful letters and then publicly denied her was not the full story. He was a piece of the story, the piece that was visible, the piece she had stood in front of on that street, but not the center of it. The center of it was a man in Helena she had never met, whose names appeared in company registrations and old correspondence, and her journals circled in ink, who had been building a structure of control across an entire territory for years, patient and methodical and invisible to anyone looking at only one piece. She was going to make him visible. Not yet. Not until she had what she needed. But she was going to make him visible, and she was going to do it in a way that held, that couldn't be quietly buried, or discredited, or made to disappear, The way documents disappeared and witnesses disappeared, and whole ranching families disappeared to Oregon without being heard from again. She was good with numbers and documents and patterns. She was good at seeing what was there when other people saw what they expected to see. She had these skills, and she had Callahan, and she had time, if they were careful, and she had 2 daughters sleep next to her, who were the reason she was careful about everything. Outside, the ranch was making its night sounds, the distant low of cattle, the creak of a fence in the wind. Once the quiet exchange of voices from the bunkhouse before someone's lamp went out. The sounds of a place that didn't know yet what was coming for it, going on with its ordinary life. She listened to them and let them do what they always did. She slept. Callahan came back from Ridgeline on a Thursday evening, 2 days after he left. And Eliza's knew from the way he dismounted, not hurried, but with a particular purposefulness that he had found something worth bringing back. She was in the yard with the girls when he rode in. Claire was in the travel bag, which had become her preferred daytime seat, and May was on a blanket on the ground, conducting her ongoing investigation of the texture of everything within arm's reach. Eliza had been out for 20 minutes, not long enough to accomplish anything except give both girls air, and give herself a break from the close smell of papers and candle wax. Callahan handed his horse to Cal Briggs without stopping and came across the yard toward her. He did not speak until he was close enough to be quiet about it. "Hooper's in Ridgeline," he said. "Has been since he sold. His brother gave him work." "Did you speak with him?" "Yes." She waited. "He talked for 2 hours," Callahan said. "I had to stop him." He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper covered in notes in his own handwriting, compressed, slightly irregular, the writing of a man trying to get words down faster than was natural for him. "I wrote what I could. There's more." She took the paper. "Come inside." They sat at the desk in the room she had made her workspace. Callahan in the chair she pulled from the corner, Eliza in her usual seat, and she read through his notes, while he drank the water she'd poured from the pitcher on the windowsill, because he had clearly not stopped to eat or drink anything recently, and was running on the particular fuel of a man who had heard important things and was still processing them. The notes were good. He had caught the essential elements, Hooper's account of the initial contact from Hargrove's representatives, the gradual nature of it, the way the pressure built over time. A supplier arrangement that began normally, and then over 18 months became something else. Pricing that shifted. A loan offered at what seemed like reasonable terms during a bad season, and then when Hooper was already committed to the loan, and the season hadn't recovered a notice that the terms had changed under a clause he had not understood when he signed. She had seen that clause language before. She recognized it without needing to look at her journal. He understood finally what was happening, Callahan said. By then he had no leverage. His land was the collateral. When he couldn't meet the revised terms, they offered to buy him out at a price that covered the loan, but nothing else. 20 years of work, and he walked away with enough to get his family to Ridgeline and take a job in his brother's freight yard. Will he speak to a federal land agent? Yes. Callahan said it without hesitation. He said, and these were his words, that the only thing he regrets is that he didn't fight back. He thought he was the only one. He didn't know it was happening to anyone else. She thought about that. The isolation of it, each rancher believing they were the only one, believing their situation was their own failure, not seeing the pattern because no one had shown it to them. That was part of the design. Keep the targets separate, keep them ashamed, let the shame do half the work. He's not the only one, she said. And now he knows that. He wants to know who else we can tell him. When the time is right. She looked at the notes again. Did he have any documentation? Anything he kept from the sale? He kept a copy of the original loan agreement and the notice of revised terms. Callahan reached into his coat again and produced an envelope. He gave me these. She took the envelope and opened it carefully. 2 documents. The original loan agreement, which was 3 pages, carefully handwritten in the legal style she had come to associate with Hargrove's operation, correct on its surface, with the dangerous language buried in the subordinate clauses. And the notice of revised terms, which was a single page, terse and formal, signed on behalf of Western Territorial Holdings by someone with the initials C. CH, not a representative, Hargrove himself. He signed it personally, she said. I noticed that. She set the documents beside her journal and looked at the expanding map of evidence she had been building. The Voss overcharging records. The Hargrove land and provisions contract renewals with their altered pricing language. The water rights settlement with its reopenable clause. The original loan with the right of first refusal. Pollard's list of 7 properties. And now Hooper's documents, with Hargrove's own initials on the notice that had taken a man's ranch from him. It was not yet enough to guarantee a federal investigation, but it was enough to make a serious case for one. We need to go to Billings, she said. Sooner than I thought. Hargrove arrives in Caldwell in 11 days. Then we go in 8. That gives Gerber time to at least open a file before Hargrove is in the territory and can be warned. Callahan nodded slowly. Who goes you, she said. You're the current title holder on a property with documented grievances. Your standing to bring a complaint is clear. She paused. I'll give you everything organized, every document, the summary, the pattern analysis. You present it. He looked at her. You should come. Leaving the ranch now, both of us would be noticed. Someone reports it to Hargrove before we reach Billings, and we've lost the advantage of him not knowing what we're doing. You could be noticed going separately, he said. A woman traveling alone with 2 babies is not invisible. She had thought about this. I'm not traveling to Billings. I'm going to Caldwell. He was quiet for a moment. You said not to go to Caldwell. I said not yet. It's yet now. She looked at her journal. There's a lawyer your father used his name as in the old correspondence as B. Crane, Caldwell. I need to find him and see if he has the original property documents, specifically anything relating to the early relationship with Western Territorial Holdings. If that early loan had additional terms we haven't seen, Crane might have them. Crane retired, Callahan said. His son took over the practice. Then his son might have the files. His son is not, Callahan paused, choosing words. He is not his father. He tends to align himself with whoever has the most influence in Caldwell, which is currently Hargrove. Yes, she absorbed this. Then I don't go to the son directly. I find out where the old files are stored, and I find a way to see them that doesn't require the son's cooperation. She thought for a moment. Does Crane's son know your father's history with Western Territorial Holdings? I don't know what his father told him. If he doesn't know, and I approach it as a routine request for historical property records, he may simply provide access without understanding the significance. And if he does know and reports to Hargrove, then Hargrove knows someone is looking at old files, which is less specific than him knowing what we have. And Callahan is already on his list. You've been on his list for years. The question is whether he knows his timeline is compromised. Callahan drummed his fingers once on the arm of the chair. It was the only visible expression of what she suspected was a significant amount of internal tension. I don't like you going to Caldwell alone, he said, not possessively, with the specific concern of a person who had learned to assess risk and was assessing this one. I've managed Caldwell before, she said. Before, Hargrove didn't know about you. He still doesn't. I'm a woman you hired to manage your records. There's nothing in that for him to notice. He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. This was a thing they had settled into over the past weeks, the ability to disagree directly, without performing politeness around it, and then either find a resolution or accept that one person's judgment had to take precedence and determine whose it should be. Marsh goes with you, he said. Not as a guard, as someone who has legitimate business in Caldwell that provides a reason for the trip. She thought about arguing this and decided it was actually reasonable. All right, and you take the girls. I was going to take the girls regardless. I'm not leaving them here. I know, he said. He stopped. Started again. I know. She looked at him. He was looking at his hands, which was unusual for him. He was not a man who looked at his hands. There was something uncomfortable in his posture. Something that had the feeling of a thing trying to be said and not finding the right form. Callahan, she said. The situation with Hargrove, he said. If he finds out what we're doing before we're ready, the risk is not just to the ranch. You understand that? Yes, you came here with nothing, and you've built something here, and I don't want. He stopped again. I want to make sure you're not carrying more of this risk than is fair. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, Cal Briggs was saying something to the horse he was brushing down, the kind of running commentary that young men sometimes made to animals when they thought no one was listening. The risk is fair, she said carefully. I chose to follow this. You didn't ask me to. I found Hargrove's name in your records before I fully understood what I was finding, and I chose to keep going. She paused. Besides, Hargrove wronged me first, before I ever found your records. Gerald Whitmore's mortgage is in Hargrove's name. Whatever was done to that man, it connected to what was done to me. I'm not here only because of your ranch. He looked up at her. I'm here because this is the same problem, she said, and I was going to follow it regardless. He nodded once, slowly. Then he stood up and she understood the conversation was finished. In the way that conversations with Callahan finished completely, without ceremony, the matter settled, and then done. I'll leave for Billings in 4 days, he said. That gives you time to prepare everything. 4 days is enough, she said. He left. She turned back to the desk and opened her journal to the page she had titled, What We Are Going to Do Instead, and wrote 2 new items, Billings, Gerber, Callahan. 8 days, Caldwell Crane files with Marsh, same window. Then she started organizing the documents. She worked that night and the next 2, sleeping only what was absolutely necessary. She created 3 complete sets of everything original documents, her written summary, the pattern analysis laid out in sequence from earliest to most recent, the company relationship diagram she had drawn and redrawn, until it was clear enough that someone seeing it for the first time could follow the logic without needing her to explain it. One set for Callahan to take to Billings. One set she would take to Caldwell. One set she hid in the room, in a place she chose carefully, because it was sensible to have something that stayed put. On the morning of the fourth day, Callahan rode for Billings. He took the documents in a saddlebag and gave her a look before he left that communicated several things, without saying any of them, and she gave him a nod that she hoped communicated that she understood and was not being careless. She and Marsh left for Caldwell 2 hours later, in the small wagon that Marsh used for supply runs, which gave the trip a normalcy that a saddle journey would not have had. The girls were in the wagon bed in the arrangement she had developed for transport travel bag for May's seat, blanket nest for Clara, and the morning was cold enough that she had them bundled more than they liked, which Clara protested and May accepted with dignity. Marsh drove. He did not speak for the first mile, which was his custom, and then he said, "You know what you're looking for in Caldwell?" "Property records," she said. "Historical files from Crane's office." "Young Crane's not going to be helpful." "I know. I'm not planning to ask him directly." She had thought this through. "Is there anyone in his office besides him?" "A clerk," Marsh said. "Boy named Aldous. His mother is Millie Pemberton, who does laundry for half the town. Knows everything and talks to the right people." He paused. "Millie has a strong opinion of Hargrove." Eliza looked at him. "You've been thinking about this." "I've been on this ranch for 7 years," Marsh said. "I've watched the shape of things without knowing what to call it. You gave me what to call it." He kept his eyes on the road. "Millie Pemberton had a brother who sold out to Western Territorial Holdings 4 years ago. She's never said straight out that she thinks it was wrong, but she's never said it was right either." "Can you get me to Millie?" "I can take you to pick up laundry," he said. "Callahan has an account. It's a normal thing." This was why Callahan had sent Marsh. Not because Marsh was large and capable of handling trouble, though he was both. Because Marsh had 7 years of knowing who in Caldwell was what, and he had been waiting for an occasion to use it. "Thank you," she said. He shrugged with one shoulder, which for Marsh was effusive. Caldwell looked exactly as she had left it. The same main street, the same arrangement of businesses, the same general feeling of a place that had decided what it was and was committed to it. She looked at the bench outside the post office where she had sat with the girls and done her first inventory, and it was occupied now by an old man who had fallen asleep in the morning sun, which struck her as the right use of a bench. She did not see Gerald Whitmore. She had wondered about this, whether seeing him would undo something in her. It didn't, partly because he wasn't there, and partly because she had stopped thinking of him as the center of the problem several weeks ago. He was still a wrong done to her, but he was a small piece now, in something much larger, and the anger had migrated to where it belonged. Marsh took her to Millie Pemberton's laundry, which was on a side street 2 blocks from the main strip, a building that announced itself by smell before you reached the door, soap and steam and the particular Cleanworks smell of a place that was always in the middle of something. Millie herself was a compact woman in her late 50s, with forearms that looked like they belonged on someone twice her size, and a face that had developed a permanent expression of efficient assessment. The look of a woman who had been evaluating situations for a long time and had gotten good at it quickly. She looked at Eliza with those assessing eyes, and then at the girls, and then at Marsh. "Callahan's laundry isn't due until Friday," she said. "I know," Marsh said. "I brought someone who needs a few minutes of your time, Millie." Millie looked at Eliza again. The assessment was thorough and did not take long. "Come in," she said. "Aldous can watch the front." Inside, the steam and the noise of the work gave them cover that a quiet room would not have. Eliza sat down on the bench. Millie indicated and laid out what she had in as compact a form as she could manage the shape of Hargrove's operation. The 7 properties, the pattern, where she needed to get. Millie listened without interrupting, which was the same quality she'd noticed in Callahan, and which she was coming to understand was rarer and more valuable than people generally recognized. When Eliza finished, Millie said, "My brother's name is on that list." "I know, so I'm sorry. He's in Cheyenne now. Works in a warehouse." Millie said it flatly, not as grief but as fact. The way people reported wounds that had healed wrong still there. Not bleeding, but changed. He thought it was his fault, bad seasons, bad decisions. Spent 2 years believing that. "It wasn't his fault," Eliza said. "I know it wasn't." Millie was quiet for a moment. "What do you need from me?" "Access to Crane's old files. Specifically anything relating to the Callahan property's early relationship with Western Territorial Holdings." "My boy Aldous works for young Crane," Millie said. "And young Crane went to Helena last week on business and won't be back until after Hargrove's visit." Eliza went still. "He went to Helena 3 days ago." Helena, where Hargrove's office was. Young Crane, who tended to align himself with whoever had the most influence in Caldwell, had gone to Helena a week before Hargrove's planned visit to Caldwell. He's reporting to Hargrove, Eliza said. I'd call it a reasonable assumption, Millie said, which means Hargrove may already know someone is asking questions. Or Crane went for an entirely unrelated reason, Millie said. Young Crane also handles land transfers for Western Territorial Holdings. He goes to Helena regularly. Eliza thought about this. Either way, the files are accessible while he's gone. Aldous has the key, Millie said. She looked at Eliza steadily. My boy is not going to do anything wrong. But if someone with a legitimate account at Crane's office needed historical property documents for a routine matter, and Aldous let that person into the files while the documents were being retrieved, that would be within his authority. I have an account, Eliza said. Callahan Ranch. Millie nodded once. She went to the door and said something to the boy at the front, and then came back and sat down. You have an hour, she said, while he takes a message for me to the church deacon, which is a real message, and will take the time it takes. That's enough, Eliza said. She went to Crane's office with Aldous, a nervous boy of about 17, who had clearly been told something by his mother that he was choosing to interpret as narrowly as possible, which was sensible of him, and he unlocked the file room and showed her where the historical property files were stored, and then stood outside the door and looked at the wall and waited. The files were organized by property and then by year, which was more order than she had expected. She found the Callahan files in under 5 minutes. The oldest ones went back 30 years, thick folders, the accumulated paper of a working ranch's legal history. She went directly to the years she needed, the period of the early loan from Western Territorial Holdings. She found the loan documentation in the second folder, and it was more complete than what Callahan had at the ranch. There were 3 additional pages she hadn't seen, addenda, signed by Thomas Callahan and countersigned by Western Territorial Holdings, that spelled out the full terms. The right of first refusal clause was there, as Callahan had described it, but there was something else. A secondary clause in the third addendum that she read twice and then wrote out in full in her journal, because she needed the exact language. The clause stated that in the event the Callahan Ranch was sold to any party other than Western Territorial Holdings during the 20-year window, Western Territorial Holdings retained the right to claim a settlement payment equal to 15% of the sale price, not a right to match the offer of financial penalty for selling to anyone else. This was different from what Callahan had described. Either he hadn't known about the addenda, or he had known and hadn't understood the significance. The clause was, she was almost certain, unenforceable. She was not a lawyer, but she had read enough legal documents to recognize language that had been drafted to intimidate rather than to legally bind the kind of clause that a person without access to good legal counsel would assume was valid, and would factor into their decisions accordingly. Thomas Callahan had apparently not told his son about it, which meant either Thomas hadn't fully understood it himself, or he had carried it as a private weight, the same way he had apparently carried the water rights situation as a problem he had managed by not naming it. She copied every relevant section and put her journal back in her coat pocket and went back to where Aldous was still examining the wall. I have what I need, she said. He nodded with visible relief and locked the file room and walked her back to the front of the office, with the careful professionalism of someone who has decided the best way through a morally complicated situation is to behave as if it is entirely ordinary. She went back to Millie's laundry. Marsh was there, drinking coffee that Millie had provided, and he looked at her face when she came in and said, "You found something." Yes. She told Millie and Marsh what she had found, not all of it, but enough. The unenforceable penalty clause. The way it would have functioned as a threat invisible to anyone who couldn't challenge it legally, potent to anyone who believed it was real. Thomas Callahan was afraid to sell to anyone else, Marsh said slowly, because he thought he'd be penalized for it. He may not have known it was likely unenforceable, she said. He may have simply believed it was a binding obligation, which meant his only option, if he had to sell, was to sell to Hargrove at Hargrove's price, Millie said. She said it with the particular flatness of someone fitting a piece into a picture they had been looking at for years without the piece. My brother's agreement probably had the same clause. Likely something similar, Eliza said. I'd need to see it to be certain. He kept a copy, Millie said. I told him to. He thought I was being stubborn. She paused. I can write to him. Please do, Eliza said. And tell him there's a federal land agent in Billings named Gerber who is going to need to hear from him. Millie looked at her steadily. Is this going to work? Actually work, not just be a thing that got tried. It was a fair question, and it deserved a fair answer. I don't know, Eliza said. What I know is that the documents exist, the pattern is clear, and we have at least 2 people who can speak to direct experience of the pressure. Whether a federal investigation follows, I can't promise. But the case is real. Millie was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that surprised Eliza. I knew your situation when you came to town. The whole street knew within an hour. I didn't come out to help you, she said it, without making it a confession, just information, the kind a person offered when they were settling an account with themselves. I want you to know I've thought about that. You couldn't have known then what I know now, Eliza said. No, but I could have offered you a cup of coffee. Millie stood up and refilled Eliza's cup, which was a kind of apology that Eliza accepted without comment. They left Caldwell in the early afternoon. The trip back was quiet for a while, Marsh driving, Eliza with her journal open on her knees, and May regarding the moving landscape with her usual scholarly attention, and Clara asleep against Eliza's side. About 3 miles out, Marsh said. Hargrove's coming in 11 days. 10 now, she said. What does that change? It means we have 10 days to hear from Callahan about Gerber, and to get Millie's brother's letter, and to decide what we do when a man comes to town to inspect his investments and finds that one of them has been documenting his operation for the past month. He'll hear about you, Marsh said. If he talks to Voss, and Voss mentions the record audit. I know, and then he'll try to make you the problem, Marsh said. Not as a question, she looked at him. Yes, that's his next move. Make me the problem, discredit me. Discredit everything I've found by discrediting the person who found it. She had been thinking about this for days. A woman with 2 children and no family in the territory, no official standing, no recognized history in this community. She was exactly the kind of person a man like Hargrove would try to make invisible, and he had done it before. How do you stop that? Marsh said. You don't hide, she said. Hiding gives the story to the other person. You get in front of it. He thought about this. What does that look like? It looks like what we're already doing, she said. Every person who knows the truth is a person who can say the truth publicly. Hooper, Millie's brother Pollard. You. She paused. The documents speak for themselves, but documents need voices. A stack of papers in an office in Billings is a complaint. The same papers, plus people who say this happened to me, is something harder to dismiss. Marsh drove for a while without speaking. Then Callahan trusts you. I know, she said. He doesn't trust easy. Since his father died, he's managed this place alone, and the way he is by not depending on anyone he can't verify. He verifies slowly. Marsh said this without editorializing, just laying out information. He's not the same as he was 3 years ago. Before the water rights business, I noticed, she said. I want you to know he was different before, Marsh said. He's not someone who closed off because that's his character. He closed off because someone made him a target when he wasn't ready for it, and he's been cautious ever since. He looked at the road. What you've done coming in and finding this, all of it, I think he's less closed off than he was 6 weeks ago. She was quiet for a moment. He's made this easier than it should have been, she said. He gave me access to the records. He listened. He went to Ridgeline without being asked twice. That matters? Yes, Marsh said. It does. They rode the last miles without talking. The ranch came into view in the late afternoon light. The buildings settled into the landscape, the way things did when they had been there long enough to belong to it. And she thought about Thomas Callahan building this place, and then watching someone find a way into it through the small print of a loan document. And she thought about Wyatt Callahan inheriting both the ranch and the vulnerability, without fully knowing the shape of either. He deserved to know the full shape of it now. All of it, the addenda, the penalty clause, the full picture of what his father had been carrying. It would not be a comfortable conversation. She had already had several uncomfortable conversations with Callahan, and she had learned that he handled them the same way he handled everything, by going very still and consulting something internal, and then coming back with a decision rather than a feeling. She respected this, even when the going still part was hard to wait through. She was ready for the conversation. She had learned in the past weeks to be ready for the hard ones. What she was not ready for was what happened 2 days later, when a rider arrived at the ranch gate in the early morning with a folded message that turned out to be from someone she had not expected to hear from. The message was from Gerald Whitmore. She read it twice, standing in the yard with the girls, because the first reading did not entirely make sense and she needed to verify it. It was 4 sentences. He had heard she was at the Callahan ranch. He knew about Hargrove he had known for a while. There was something she needed to see, something he had been holding for 2 years, because he had been afraid to do anything with it. He would come to the ranch if she would agree to it. She stood there for a long moment. Then she wrote back yes, and gave the message to the rider, and went inside to her journal and opened it, and wrote at the top of a fresh page, "What Gerald Whitmore knows." She underlined it. She did not know yet what he would bring. She did not know if it would be useful, or another dead end, or something she had already found from another direction. She did not know if she trusted him. She didn't, not yet, not fully. And she was aware that a message from Gerald Whitmore arriving 2 days before Callahan was expected back from Billings, with Hargrove due in Caldwell in 8 days, was either a genuine offering from a man who had spent 2 years building up the courage to do what was right, or it was a trap of some kind that she would need to see clearly. She would prepare for both. Outside, Cal Briggs was making his usual morning visit to the girls, and she could hear his silence and Clara's sounds of delight even from inside. And she thought about how completely ordinary those sounds were, how completely separate from everything she was carrying, and she let them be ordinary for exactly the moment they lasted. Then she went back to work. Gerald Whitmore arrived at the ranch on a gray morning, riding a horse that looked as tired as he did, and Eliza watched him come through the gate from the window of her room with the same careful attention she gave to everything, not with the anger she had expected to feel, or not only that, but with the assessment of a woman who had learned to read situations before she entered them. He was smaller than she remembered from the street in Caldwell. That happened sometimes. People who had loomed large in a difficult moment shrank when you saw them again from a position of steadiness. He dismounted in the yard and stood there with his hat in his hands, which was either genuine humility or a performance of it, and she decided she would know which within the first few minutes of conversation. She went out to meet him. He saw her and stopped. Up close, she could see that he had aged in the 6 weeks since Caldwell's Main Street, not dramatically, but the way people aged when they had been carrying something heavy and sleeping badly. There were lines around his eyes that had the look of worry rather than weather. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, because she had been using the name since Ohio and saw no reason to abandon it now. "Come inside." She did not offer him warmth and she did not offer him coldness. She offered him a chair at the table in the main room and water, and the particular neutral attention of a woman who had decided to hear what someone had to say before deciding what it meant. He sat down. He put his hat on the table and then picked it up again and held it in his lap, which told her something about his state of mind. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "You owe me considerably more than that," she said. "But start with the explanation." He looked at her for a moment, something in his face that was recognition, she thought, of the person she was, rather than the person he had expected to deal with. Then he nodded and began. He had written the letters, all 11 of them. He had meant every word. He had been, at the time of writing, a man who was trying to build something honest after a series of years that had not been, and here he paused and chose his words straightforward. He had thought a wife, a real arrangement, something with its own weight and permanence, would help him become the person the letters described. The arrangement with Western Territorial Holdings had begun 3 years before Eliza arrived. Alone, initially his operation was smaller than Callahan's, a modest ranch, not much water but enough for what he was running. The terms had seemed reasonable. They had not remained reasonable. By the time Eliza's stage arrived in Caldwell, he had received a visit from a man named Sutter, who worked directly for Hargrove. Sutter had made it clear without ever saying anything that could be directly quoted or used against him that Gerald's debt situation was precarious, that Western Territorial Holdings had certain options available to them regarding his outstanding balance, and that it would be unfortunate if complications arose from Gerald's new domestic arrangement. A woman with 2 children, Sutter had said with the particular smoothness of a man saying something terrible in pleasant language, could create complications. Public attention. Questions about the nature of Gerald's finances, his property, his standing. "He told you to deny me," Eliza said. "He suggested it would be in my interest," Gerald said. He stopped. "I made a choice. I know what it cost you. I've known since I watched you walk away from that street. And you've spent 6 weeks doing nothing about it," she said. Not with cruelty, but with accuracy, because accuracy was what the situation required. "Yes," he said it without defense. "I was afraid. I want to be honest with you about that. I was afraid, and I told myself I was protecting what little I had left. And both of those things were true, and neither of them was sufficient reason for what I did to you." She looked at him for a long moment. The apology was real, she had developed, over years of dealing with people in difficult circumstances, a reasonable ability to distinguish between genuine remorse and the performance of it. And this had the texture of something real. It did not fix what had happened. It did not restore the 4 days she had spent with nowhere to sleep, and 2 babies and $4.50. But it was real. "What did you bring me?" she said. He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. Not a single document, but several. "Sutter's visits were not the first time Hargrove's people contacted me," he said. "The first time was 18 months ago, when they restructured my loan terms. I kept everything. Every letter, every notice, every document they sent." He put the envelope on the table, "including one that I think is different from anything else you might have." She opened the envelope and went through it systematically, the way she went through everything in order, reading fully before forming conclusions. The loan restructuring documents were there, with the same clause patterns she had seen in Hooper's papers, and the Callahan contracts. The notices from Western Territorial Holdings, 2 of them signed with the same C, H initials she had seen before, and then the document at the bottom of the stack. It was a letter, written on Western Territorial Holdings letterhead, addressed not to Gerald Whitmore, but to a man named Aldridge, a name she didn't recognize, and it was instructions. Specific instructions, written in plain language without the legal camouflage of the formal documents, about how to handle what the letter called resistant property holders in the Caldwell territory. The language described a process, first the supplier relationship, then the loan restructuring, then the pressure on personal circumstances, then the offer to buy at the distressed price. It was in essence a blueprint. Hargrove's method written down, signed at the bottom, not with initials, but with a full signature. Calder Hargrove. The full name in ink on a document that described exactly what he had done to 7 ranching families and was in the process of doing to an 8th. She sat very still for a moment. "Where did you get this?" she said. "Aldridge worked for Hargrove for 6 years, Gerald said. He was the man who managed the territory operations, the one who brought in Voss, who arranged the loan restructurings, who coordinated with Sutter. He left Hargrove's employ about a year ago. I don't know all the reasons. He came to me 2 months ago and gave me this letter and said he wanted out of whatever was still coming. He said he'd kept it as protection." Gerald paused. "He told me if anything happened to him, I should make sure it got to someone who could use it." "What happened to him?" she said. "He left the territory," Gerald said. "Went to Denver, as far as I know. I have his address." She looked at the letter again. The signature was clear. The date was clear. The language was unambiguous. This was not pattern evidence or document analysis or the careful reconstruction of a scheme from its component parts. This was Hargrove's own words describing his own method in his own hand. This was enough. "Why did you wait 6 weeks?" she said. She asked it without heat, because she genuinely wanted to understand the answer. Gerald looked at his hat. "Because I was afraid of what he'd do if I moved against him, and it failed," he said. "And because I knew that bringing this to you meant admitting everything in front of whoever you brought it to. He stopped. I knew what I'd done to you. I wasn't sure you'd let me help. I would have let you help 6 weeks ago," she said. "I would have let you help on the street in Caldwell if you'd had the courage to say something true." He nodded. He did not argue with this. "Hargrove arrives in Caldwell in 6 days," she said, "and Callahan is currently in Billings with a federal land agent." She stood up and went to the window and looked at the north field she had picked up this habit. From Callahan, she realized, using that particular view as a place to think. If Gerber moves on this before Hargrove arrives in Caldwell, Hargrove will know we've acted and he'll run or he'll lawyer up with people better than what Gerber has access to locally. "What do you want to do?" Gerald said. "I want Hargrove in Caldwell when Gerber moves," she said. "I want him here in the territory, where jurisdiction is clear and he can't claim he was elsewhere." She turned from the window. "Which means I Callahan to delay Gerber by 3 days. And I need Hargrove to walk into Caldwell believing everything is as he left it." Gerald looked at her carefully. "You want him to feel safe." "I want him to walk into a room where the walls are already built," she said. "Not to chase him into a corner. To let him stand in the center of a room that is already a corner, before he understands that's where he is." There was a silence. Then Gerald said, "What do you need from me?" "Your testimony," she said, "in full. Sutter's visits, the loan terms, everything you were told and everything you did. And Aldridge's address in Denver, because Gerber will want to reach him directly." She paused. "And the letter?" "You can have all of it," he said. She looked at him, this man who had failed her catastrophically and then spent 6 weeks being afraid and had finally arrived with something that might change everything, and she thought about what it meant that the most important piece of evidence in the case against Calder Hargrove had been sitting in Gerald Whitmore's coat for 2 months while she had been building her case document by document from scratch. She thought, this is what happens when people are kept isolated and afraid. The pieces exist. They are in different hands, in different places, and no one person can see the whole picture, because no one person has been allowed to see all the pieces. Hargrove's greatest tool was not money or legal language or patience, though he had used all of those. His greatest tool was the space between people, the silence in which each victim believed they were alone. She had been walking through that silence for 6 weeks, connecting the pieces, and here was the last one, delivered by the man she had least expected to deliver it. "You should stay," she said, "until this is resolved. It's not safe for you to go back to Caldwell if there's any chance Hargrove's people are watching for movement." Gerald looked surprised, genuinely, the surprise of a man who had not expected to be offered anything. "Marsh will find you space in the bunkhouse," she said. "It's not comfortable, but it's not Caldwell." "Thank you," he said quietly. "Don't thank me," she said. "Be useful." Callahan returned from Billings the following afternoon, and she met him at the gate before he had fully dismounted, which was not her usual approach. and he read her face and dismounted quickly. What happened? She told him about Gerald. She told him about the letter. She watched his face move through several things, the tightening at the mention of Gerald's name, the sharp attention when she described the letter, the stillness when she explained what it meant. Gerber, he said. What did Gerber say? Tell me first. He had been thorough in Billings, and Gerber had been, as Pollard had promised, honest. He had listened to the full presentation, examined the documents, and confirmed that the pattern constituted grounds for a federal investigation into fraudulent land practices. He had asked for 1 week to prepare warrants. I need you to send word to Billings tonight, she said. Ask Gerber to delay by 3 days. Tell him a Hargrove will be in Caldwell territory on that timeline, and that we have new evidence, a direct written statement of method in Hargrove's own signature. Callahan looked at her for a long moment. Gerber agreed to work with us on timing. He agreed that having Hargrove present in the territory at the time of investigation was preferable to acting while he was in Helena with access to his full legal operation, she said. He said so explicitly. This is not us manipulating the process. This is us giving the process the best possible conditions to work. He nodded slowly. And Gerald Whitmore is in my bunkhouse. Yes. Another pause. How do you feel about that? It was an unexpected question. He did not usually ask her how she felt about things, not directly. She considered it honestly. I feel that what he did was wrong, and that the evidence he brought may be what resolves this, she said. Both of those things are true, and I'm carrying them at the same time. She paused. He was pressured, but he made a choice. Other people who were pressured found other choices. I'm not going to pretend that doesn't matter because he finally showed up with something useful. Callahan looked at her for a long moment. That's fair, he said. It's accurate, she said. I'm not sure it's fair. I'm not sure fair is the right measure for everything. He sent the message to Billings that night through Pollard's contact, and they settled into the particular tension of waiting the kind where you have done everything you can do, and the next moves belong to other people, and to timing, and to the unpredictable behavior of a man who did not yet know that. The room he was walking into was already a corner. In those 3 days, the ranch ran its ordinary business. Cattle, fence lines, supply runs, the daily arithmetic of a working property going about its work. Eliza finished her complete document summary, all of it now, including Gerald's materials, the Aldrich letter at the center, organized and cross-referenced so that a reader could follow the logic from beginning to end without needing her to explain it. She made 4 copies. She was not taking chances. She also spent time in the evenings doing something she had not done much of since arriving at the ranch. She sat with the girls without a journal open or a document in her lap, just sat with them, letting Clara pull at her hair with those small, determined hands and watching May watch the world. May had started reaching for things in the past week, deliberate reaches, not random swipes. The concentrated effort of a person who had decided that the gap between herself and an object of interest was a problem to be solved. Clara had started laughing. A real laugh, unexpected, triggered by things that made no obvious sense, a sound from outside of the particular angle of afternoon light, once simply by looking at Eliza's face, which Eliza had not been prepared for, and which had done something to her chest that she was not going to examine too closely. They were 8 months old. They had traveled hundreds of miles and slept in storage rooms and been carried across washes and set in travel bags used as seats, and been present for conversations about fraud and land rights and federal investigations, and they were fine. They were more than fine. They were becoming people, right in front of her, with specific personalities and specific ways of meeting the world. May's scholarship, Clara's delight, and she thought about Thomas Callahan, making the best choice he could see at the time, and Gerald Whitmore sitting in his coat with a letter for 2 months, and Hooper believing for 2 years that his failure was his own, and she thought about what it meant to be a person in a situation too large for one person, and how the answer was never, in her experience, to become larger. The answer was to find the other people who were in the same situation and make the situation smaller by dividing it. On the 3rd evening, Callahan found her in the yard, after the girls were settled, and stood beside her, looking at the north field, which was lit by the last of the day's light, in a way that made it look like something worth keeping. Tomorrow, he said. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Gerber is bringing 2 deputies and a representative from the land commissioner's office. They'll reach Caldwell by midday, and Hargrove's people will have told him by then that everything in Caldwell is as he expects it, she said. He'll be in the hotel or at the land office with young Crane. Young Crane came back from Helena yesterday, Callison said. Marsh heard it. Then Crane will be with Hargrove, she said. That's actually useful. If Crane has been coordinating with Hargrove, having them together means Gerber gets both in the same location. Callahan looked at her sidelong. You're not worried. I'm very worried, she said. Worry is useful when it makes you careful. It becomes a problem when it makes you still. He was quiet again. Then when this is over, he stopped. She waited. When this is over, he said again, and then did not continue for long enough that she understood he was not going to finish the sentence in the form he had started it. He shifted and tried again. I'd like you to stay. Not as the person who manages the records. As another stop. He was not, she had learned, a man who was comfortable with statements he couldn't fully verify before making them. Callahan, she said, yes, I know what you're trying to say. I'm making a poor effort at it. You're making a characteristic effort at it, she said, which is to say careful and slow, and with full awareness that what you're saying might be wrong, and you'll have to stand by it anyway. Something shifted in his face, not quite the almost smile, but adjacent to it, and more than that. More open than anything she had seen from him before. I'm not going anywhere, she said. When this is over, we can have the rest of the conversation. All right, he said. All right, she said. They stood there for a while longer, which was not nothing. Caldwell the next morning was ordinary on its surface, the main street doing its usual business, the feed store and the general store, and the hotel going about their morning. Hargrove's presence had not changed the public texture of the town, which meant either he was keeping a low profile, or the town had simply normalized around him the way towns did around power that had been present long enough. Eliza went with Callahan, Marsh, and Gerald. She had considered not going, had turned the question over several times, thinking about the girls, thinking about whether her presence was necessary or whether it was pride. She had left the girls with Cal Briggs, who had taken the responsibility with the seriousness of someone who understood what the morning meant, and May had regarded him on departure with her standard scholarly attention, and Clara had laughed at something, and Eliza had walked to the wagon thinking, they are going to be fine, and I need to be here for this. She needed to be here because she was the one who understood all of it. Every document, every company name, every clause. If Gerber needed to explain something quickly or find something in the record, she was the person who could do it in the time available. That was the practical reason. The other reason she did not examine too closely, but it was there. She had been on that street 6 weeks ago with nowhere to sleep, and 2 babies and $4.50, and she had been told by a man in front of the whole town that she did not exist. She was going to be present when that same town saw what the truth actually was. Not for revenge. She was clear with herself about this. Revenge was a kind of noise, and what she wanted was clarity. She wanted the record corrected. She wanted the shape of what had happened to be visible in a way that could not be ignored or rewritten. Gerber was a compact man in his 50s, with the look of someone who had done this kind of work long enough to have stopped being dramatic about it. He was at the land office when they arrived, with his 2 deputies and the land commissioner's representative, a younger man who looked slightly overwhelmed by the morning and was managing it by writing everything down. Hargrove was in the hotel. Gerber knew this because he had confirmed it before they arrived. Young Crane was with him as she had predicted. Gerber looked at Eliza when Callahan introduced her, and she could see him making the same assessment that most people made when they understood the role she had played in assembling the case, the recalibration between what they expected and what was in front of them. She had learned to wait through the recalibration without comment. The letter, Gerber said. Aldridge's letter. You have the original? Here, she said, and gave him the document from the envelope. He read it. He read it twice the way she had. Then he looked at her. This is the signature. Yes, and Aldridge is reachable. Gerald Whitmore has his address in Denver, she said. He's willing to testify. Gerber looked at Gerald, who nodded once with the careful steadiness of a man who has made a decision and is committed to it even though it costs him. All right, Gerber said. Here's how this works. He explained it plainly. He would go to the hotel, present the warrants, and take Hargrove into federal custody pending investigation. Young Crane would be detained for questioning regarding his role in the land transfer documentation. The deputies would secure the land office records. The process would be orderly. He'll have lawyers, Callahan said. He will, Gerber agreed. Good ones. This will not be over today. I want to be honest with you about that. What today does is open an investigation with sufficient evidence to sustain it, and it prevents Hargrove from returning to Helena to manage what's coming from a position of security. The full resolution, the properties, the recovered funds, the criminal proceedings that takes time. How much time, Gerald said. A year, Gerber said. Maybe more. Federal land fraud cases move slowly. He looked at all of them in turn. But they move. She had known this. She had told herself she knew this. It was still slightly different to hear it said plainly by the man holding the warrants. What about the affected properties, she said. The ones Western Territorial Holdings acquired. That depends on the investigation findings, Gerber said. Where purchases were made under fraudulent pressure, the legal standard for remedy is clear. Whether individual claimants pursue that remedy is their own decision, and it requires their own legal process. He paused. I'd recommend they find good representation. I'll see what I can do about that. she said and meant it. What followed was not dramatic in the way that dramatic moments in stories usually were. There was no confrontation in the street, no shouting, no moment of visible collapse. Gerber walked to the hotel with his deputies in the late morning, and Eliza stood on the boardwalk across the street with Callahan and Marsh and Gerald and watched the door and waited. Mrs. Alcott came out of the general store behind them and stood nearby without saying anything. She had been told enough by Millie, Eliza suspected, because Millie had a gift for efficient communication to understand the shape of the morning, and she was present in the way that people were present when they wanted to be witnesses without being participants. Hargrove came out of the hotel with Gerber's hand on his arm, and young Crane came behind him with a deputy, and the ordinariness of it was almost strange, 2 men in good clothes being walked across Caldwell's Main Street on a clear morning. Nothing explosive about it, just the quiet completion of a process that had been months in the building. Hargrove was older than she had pictured. 60s, with the bearing of a man who had spent decades being deferred to, the particular posture of someone for whom power had become invisible because it was always present. He looked across the street, and his eyes moved across the group standing there, and when they landed on Eliza, they stayed. She looked back at him. She did not look away, and she did not make anything of the moment. She simply met his eyes with the same steady attention she gave to everything, and let him see whatever he saw. He looked away first. It was not satisfying in the way that satisfaction was supposed to feel. It was something quieter, the specific relief of a weight that has been carried long enough that you've stopped noticing it, and then you put it down, and the absence of it is the first thing you feel, rather than the lightness. She had been carrying this since a street in Caldwell 6 weeks ago, and some part of her had been carrying it since Ohio, since James, who didn't come back, since the accumulation of being a person in circumstances that kept requiring her to start over. She was not starting over. Not this time. This time she was standing still and watching something end. Gerald stood beside her and did not say anything, which was the right choice. She was not ready to resolve everything with Gerald, and she might not be for some time, and she appreciated that he seemed to understand this without being told. Callahan was on her other side, close enough that she was aware of him, and he said nothing either. Mrs. Alcott behind them said quietly, "You walked into this town with 2 babies and nowhere to sleep." "Yes," Eliza said. "I should have offered you coffee, Mrs. Alcott said. "You offered me the storage room," Eliza said. That was enough. Mrs. Alcott made a small sound that might have been disagreement. The weeks that followed were not simple. Gerber had told the truth about the timeline federal processes moved at their own speed, indifferent to the urgency of individual lives. There were depositions and correspondence and a trip to Billings that Callahan made twice and Eliza made once, sitting across from Gerber's formal desk, with her organized documents and answering questions in the careful language that legal proceedings required. Hooper came from Ridgeline and gave his testimony. Millie's brother came from Cheyenne, a quieter version of the man Millie had described, worn smooth by 2 years of believing the wrong story about himself, but there and willing. Aldridge was reached in Denver and confirmed in writing what his letter had stated, and agreed to testify in person when the time came. Young Crane, faced with the full scope of what Gerber had assembled, made a decision that surprised no one who had known him. He cooperated, fully, in exchange for consideration. What he provided was 3 years of documented correspondence between himself and Hargrove's Helena operation, the full paper trail of the land transfers, every transaction logged and dated. He had, it turned out, kept meticulous records, because he had been afraid, in some part of himself, that the arrangement would eventually require him to produce them in his own defense. The fear had been accurate. It had also, in the end, served the purpose of justice, which was not the same as innocence but was not nothing. Hargrove's lawyers were as good as Callahan had predicted, and the legal proceedings extended into the following year. But Gerber had been right that sufficient evidence sustained an investigation, and the investigation did not stop. Properties acquired under fraudulent pressure became the subject of federal review. Hooper was among the first to receive formal notification that his sale was under examination and that he had standing to pursue remedy. He cried when Callahan told him. He was not a man who cried easily. From what Callahan described, Eliza had not been present for that conversation. But he had been carrying the wrong story for 2 years, and someone had finally handed him the right one, and the relief of it was physical. She understood that. She understood it specifically and without distance. Gerald Whitmore stayed in the territory. He did not return to his original property. That situation was complicated by his own compromised arrangements with Western Territorial Holdings, and the resolution of it was slow. But he stayed in the area and worked, and he came to the ranch twice more during the legal proceedings, and on the second visit she sat with him long enough to have the conversation they had not fully had when he first arrived. I want to ask you something, he said. Go ahead. If I had never written them, you would never have come here. No, she said. And you would never have found this. He gestured vaguely at the ranch, at the territory, at everything that the word this was standing in for. Probably not, she said. He sat with that for a moment. I don't know what to do with that. Neither do I, she said honestly. I think some things don't resolve into a clean accounting. They just happen the way they happened, and you take what's true from each part. She paused. What's true is that you wrote to me with honest intentions and then made a dishonest choice when you were afraid. Both of those things are true. I don't have to reconcile them into one version of you. He looked at her. Do you forgive me? She thought about this seriously because it deserved serious thought. I don't know yet, she said. I think that's a question I need more time with. What I know is that you came when you finally could, and you brought what mattered, and I'm going to take that at its value without deciding yet what it means for everything else. He nodded. He seemed to find this more satisfying than a direct answer, which she thought was probably because it was more honest than a direct answer would have been. The girls turned 1-year-old in the spring. May walked first 7 days before Clara, which no one had predicted, because May was the careful one, and Clara was the bold one, and careful people were supposed to take longer. But May had apparently done her assessment of the problem, reached her conclusions, and then simply done it, without announcement, crossing 4 feet of floor in the main house with the focused expression of a scholar who has finished her research. Clara watched this happen and then spent 2 days visibly calculating before standing up and taking 6 steps directly to Cal Briggs, who was her preferred audience for achievements. Eliza watched all of this and felt the particular fullness of a person who has arrived somewhere without quite knowing they were traveling there. Callahan asked her not on the day of the girl's birthday, but a few weeks after, on an evening in late spring. The North Field was green in a way that made the water rights dispute feel distant, but not forgotten to marry him. He asked it the way he did most things, directly without embellishment, with the awareness that she might say something he hadn't anticipated, and the willingness to stand by what he'd said regardless. She did not say yes immediately. She sat with it for the length of time it took to think about it honestly, which was not very long but was not nothing. I'm not easy to be married to, she said. I know, he said. I'm going to keep working. The records, the case support for the other families, there's more to do. I'm not going to put that aside. I know that too, he said. I'm not asking you to put it aside. I'm asking if you want to build this with me. She looked at him, this man who had opened a gate to a strange woman with 2 babies and asked what skills she had, who had listened when she brought him the shape of his own problem, who had sent Marsh to Caldwell with her, because he was not going to pretend concern was weakness, who had stood beside her on a boardwalk in Caldwell and said nothing because the moment didn't need words. Yes, she said. He nodded once. Then all right. All right, she said. It was not a romantic conclusion. There were no promises made in language they couldn't keep. There was just 2 people who had been alone for a long time, for different reasons and in different ways, deciding that they were not going to be alone anymore, and accepting that this decision came with all the imperfection and uncertainty that any real thing comes with. That was, she had come to understand, the nature of belonging, not the absence of difficulty, not the guarantee of outcomes, not the resolution of everything into a clean and satisfying shape. Belonging was the decision to stay in a place when it would be easier to go, and to be honest about what you found there, and to carry the hard parts alongside the good ones without pretending the hard parts didn't exist. She had walked 8 miles with 2 babies and no money and no certainty, and she had found not rescue, not salvation, not a man who solved the problem, but a place where her skills were real and her presence mattered, and where the work she was capable of doing had consequence beyond herself. The ranch did not become a perfect place. Perfect places did not exist, and she had no interest in pretending otherwise. The legal proceedings continued through the year and into the next, slow and grinding, and requiring attention she sometimes wished she could give to other things. Some of the affected families recovered their property. Some received financial remedy. Some did not get what they had lost because the law moved slowly and was not always just, and the best you could say was that it was better than nothing, which was both true and insufficient, and had to be accepted as both things at once. Hargrove's operation was dismantled by degrees, the subsidiaries wound down, the properties under federal review returned to examination, the man himself subject to proceedings that would extend for years. He did not walk away clean. He also did not, in the end, face the full measure of what he had done, because the full measure of what he had done was larger than any legal process could contain. That was the truth of it, and she wrote it in her journal because she was a person who wrote down true things even when they were unsatisfying. Clara and May grew up on the ranch, which was the only home they would ever know, and they grew up around a family that had been assembled from people who had needed somewhere to be, Marsh with his 7 years of quiet loyalty, Cal Briggs who had found in the twins a reason to stay when he might have drifted, Gerald who came by sometimes and had learned over time to be a person she could tolerate, Millie Pemberton, who visited twice a year and sat at the kitchen table and talked with the particular directness of a woman who had stopped pretending things were fine when they weren't. Hooper came once, with his family, on the way back to his property when the Federal Review concluded in his favor. He stood in the yard and looked at the ranch and then at Eliza and said, "You didn't know me when you started this." "No," she said. "You didn't do this for me specifically." "No," she agreed. He thought about this. "How do you thank someone for something like that?" "You don't have to," she said. "You went to Billings and you told the truth. That was yours. I just gave you somewhere to put it." That was the thing she had understood. Finally, clearly, in a way she could articulate, she had not saved anyone. That was not the story. Every person who had been wronged by Calder Hargrove had survived the wronging on their own terms, had carried their piece of the truth in their own hands, had simply been waiting, some of them, without knowing they were waiting for the space to put it down somewhere it would count. She had made that space. She had walked 8 miles and asked for honest work, and then done honest work, and in the course of doing it, she had found the pattern and followed it, and given each person's truth a place to stand beside all the others, where it was larger than any single piece. That was what she had done, not heroism, not rescue, just attention and patience and the refusal to let the space between people be used against them. May, at 2 years old, had developed a habit of following Eliza to the desk in the mornings and sitting beside her with her own small piece of paper, drawing with a pencil held in the earnest grip of a child who has decided that what the adult is doing is important. Clara, meanwhile, had decided that mornings were for following Callahan, which meant she spent a significant portion of her time in the yard being carried on the back of a man who had taught himself, gradually and without comment, how to manage a horse and a 1-year-old simultaneously. Eliza watched this from the window sometimes, the morning light on the north field, her daughters growing into the people they were going to be, the ranch going about its work with the sounds she had learned to find steadying, and she thought about a woman who had stood on a main street with nowhere to sleep, and had written in a journal in the dark that the only starting place she had was a starting place. She had been right about that. She had been right that 8 miles was walkable. She had been right that honest work was a different kind of currency than goodwill. She had been right that the space between people was where the harm happened, and that bringing people together around the truth was how the harm stopped. She had also been wrong about things, had misjudged timing twice, had trusted an instinct about young Crane that turned out to be more complicated than she'd assessed, had been angrier at Gerald for longer than was useful and known it, and not been able to fully stop it. She had been imperfect and uncertain and sometimes afraid, and she had done the work anyway, and the work had been real. That was the only measure she had ever found that held up. Not whether you were afraid, but whether you moved when it mattered. Not whether you were certain, but whether you were honest about your uncertainty and kept going anyway. She opened her journal to a fresh page and wrote the date at the top, because she had always dated her entries. And then she looked at the blank space below it for a moment. Outside, Clara laughed at something. May's pencil made small, deliberate marks on her paper. Eliza began to write.